So many things happened over the years. At first, I just thought it was the place we lived, until we moved, and the paranormal followed us. I was born in London around the mid-80s. Growing up, my mum was very spiritual. She would read tarot and runes, and we lived in a small maisonette on a council housing estate that was built sometime in the mid-70s. Odd things would always happen. Toys being moved, strange noises, even to the extent of what some would call a mimic. At my young age, I didn't know that an imaginary friend was only seen by the one person who created it in their mind. For as long as I can remember, I had always seen a young boy with dark hair, blue eyes and pale skin, dressed in a cowboy outfit, playing along the landing, although there were no boys in our block other than my big brother. I had always thought it was perhaps a kid from another block, but I never recognized him as someone from our school. It was in the early 90s, and most people left their doors open during the day or at least unlocked. I remember coming downstairs and seeing the young boy in my hallway. He looked at me with a blank expression and walked off. He never said a single word to me ever. I remember my mum would have hushed conversations with her friends about my sister and her imaginary friend. She seemed worried that my sister, who is 5 years older than me, still had what she saw as a childish imagination. She'd been getting into some serious trouble, which wasn't like her, and was blaming her imaginary friend. One evening, I was on my way to the toilet when I heard my sister talking in the bathroom. The bathroom had one of those sliding doors with a hook lock that never seems to close all the way. I was confused and peeked through the slither in the door. There, knelt on the floor leaning into the bath, was my sister, and sat in the bath was the young lad. I stared at him frozen. She was talking to him like having a full two-way conversation, but he was saying nothing. That night as we were laying in bed, I asked my sister about the boy. She was shocked. She couldn't believe I could see the cowboy. I don't know how long this kid stayed with her. I didn't dare ask. He creeped me out. But years later, after we had all moved away, I was sat in her kitchen with her as she asked her son why he had done something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it had concerned us both. Her young son looked her dead in the face, shrugged his shoulders and told us, "Cowboy told me to do it." Now on to the next story. It was coming up to Christmas of 1996. My mom was fiddling with a cassette player, my stepdad was at work, my brother and one of my sisters were at my friends' houses, and we had some neighbors over. My sister had gone upstairs to use the toilet, but about 30 seconds after she left the room, I heard my mum say, "Well, that was quick, you didn't flush?" We had all turned to the doorway to see my sister standing there smiling at us. Then we heard the flush from upstairs. She just faded, for lack of a better word. A moment later, my sister walks back down the room confused as to why my mum is staring at her. Now I have to say this. My sister is the spitting image of my mum's mum who passed away in 1987. We moved in 1997. As I said before, my mum would read runes and tarot cards. It was a frequent thing for her cards to be blown off the table. She would also have a blue velvet reading mat. Once, she had left her cards set up and gone to answer the door. I happened to be in the room. No one else touched her cards or even the table. When she returned and started to turn the cards face up, underneath was a pile of skin flakes. We had cup hooks on the underside of a cupboard that was above a serving hatch. My mum had her teacups hanging from it, and one day, those cups literally exploded one by one with no explanation. Also, for as long as I can remember, I've always been able to see things not everyone could. I have also known things I shouldn't know. For example, August 1997. I'm 11 years old, and I shared a room with one of my sisters. We both had been in bed and asleep for a few hours when I woke up from a dream in a panic. Now, I don't know why I was panicking, but I almost fell out of my bed and hurried to wake up my sister and told her that Princess Diana was dying. My sister, annoyed at me for waking her up and telling me to go back to bed and that it was just a dream. But I insisted. I was in tears. She came downstairs with me to prove her point. She turned on the news channel, and it didn't take long before it flashed up on the screen and everything was overtaken with the breaking news about the accident. This freaked my sister out so badly that while we sat there glued to the TV, she went to wake up my mum and stepdad. A few months later, my mum took me to this spiritualist church where they had mediums and Reiki healers. After the mediums had finished, one of the Reiki healers waved us over. She said she was drawn to me. She sat me down and started a healing session, and we both felt what I can only describe as static around us. When she came and knelt in front of me and asked how long I had been a spiritual bridge, she said my energy told her that the paranormal is drawn to me, like it feeds off my energy in order to make its way over to us. She told me I should wear obsidian for my own protection. I didn't for many years, but have done so for the past 20. The night before 9/11, I was staying with my eldest sister, and she says I woke up to ask her why someone would fly a plane into the building. I don't remember doing this, but she told me about it the next day. I had no idea what the Twin Towers were, let alone where they were, and when the news broke, she dropped her coffee on the floor and stared open-mouthed at me. I lived with my dad for a little while, over a year when I was a teenager. We had a very sweet dog and lived in an old 2-bed house in a small rural town. The house itself always made me uneasy. I never liked to be alone there. Well, one night when my dad was at work, I sat in the dining room on the computer, talking to my friends in the States on Yahoo Chat. My dog was curled up beside me. Where I sat, my back was to the door. I never felt comfortable leaving the door open when I was at the computer. It must have been around 1 a.m. when my dog whimpered and her ears perked up. I looked at her and felt a sense of dread. I remember I placed my hand on the top of her head for comfort and was just about to say something to her when a huge bang made me jump from my seat. The dog darted towards the door, all hair standing on end. A deep growl coming from her, which was something I'd never heard her do before. Then another. It was coming from above us in my room. I stood there in fear, my dog between me and the door. I heard loud footsteps running down the stairs. They were so hard that my dad's ornamental guns fell off the wall that blocked the stairs. They stopped at the door. My dog starts to back away in fear, and the door begins to shake violently. It felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds or so of shaking before the door bursts open so violently that one of the wood panels cracked. There was no one there. I was just frozen in fear, with my dog now cowering at my feet, growling. After a moment, I regained control of my limbs and checked the hall. No one. I was and had been alone all this time. This isn't a webcam, and scared my friends as much as it did me. Now, I don't always hear or see things. It's getting rarer the older I get, but I can always sense when there's something around. My friend has a childlike spirit in her house. He doesn't like her Hoover. When I told her this, she laughed and responded with, "Yeah, I know. Apparently it will turn itself off when she's using it." Maybe 14 years ago now, I woke up in the middle of the night to see a very elderly Indian man dressed in traditional Southern Indian clothing, standing next to my bed, staring at my sleeping husband. I didn't feel fear or apprehension, more akin to a wave of warmth and love. I had no idea who he was, but mentioned it to my husband that he had a visit during the night. He was skeptical, so I didn't go into detail. The following January, we went to India to visit my husband's family. There was a photo on a shelf, wearing the same clothes. I come to discover it was my husband's late grandfather. So those are the events of my life. Am I haunted? Or am I just what the Reiki healer said I am? I guess it's down to you to decide. Last night we checked into the Sterling Villas in Uluwatu, which happens to be next door to the abandoned Wyndham Dreamland Resort for a one-night stay. During the day everything was fine. We went out early into the evening around 7 p.m. and returned at around 9 p.m. Before we went out, we made sure to leave the air conditioning on in our room, which is a separate building to the living room/kitchen area, so that it would be nice and cool when we got back. Here's a brief summary of some things that happened when we returned. We noticed the air conditioning had switched off. I guess it's not the most unusual thing to happen, so we switched the aircon back on and then went into the pool. When we got out of the pool and returned to the room, it was off again. About half an hour later, I went back into the room to turn it off and get my water bottle in order to make tea. And while I was making tea in the living room, which is a completely separate unit to the bedroom, I noticed from the reflection in the mirror that the TV in our room was on. I asked my friend if she'd switched it on and she said no. Maybe it was a ghost. As soon as she said that, the TV switched off by itself. We were a bit freaked out at this point. My friend told me that she thought she'd seen an all-black figure walk across the window where the pool and table are in the mirror's reflection while she'd been getting ready for us to go out earlier in the evening. At first she thought it was me, but I of course wasn't dressed in black, but she just didn't want to freak me out. We decided to try and not overthink it, and so we went to bed. I had left my cup and the teaspoon on the table outside my bedroom by the pool. I left the teaspoon on top of the empty paper creamer packet so that it didn't drip on the table as it had been in my tea. When we were in bed, we heard a noise that sounded like the teaspoon being put down on the marble table. Not a sound like it had been dropped, but just put down with a reasonable amount of force. We were very freaked out by that point. I decided to try and Google some of the hotel reviews and found the following, which I think you might appreciate. These villas look good from the photos, but the service and staff are not great. Apart from that, all 5 of us experienced supernatural activities. Then found out there are 2 large abandoned hotels next to us. After asking locals, they confirmed that the abandoned villas at Wyndham Hotel next door are haunted, and you can see figures of light at night, even though the electricity has been disconnected. We didn't take it seriously at first and laughed about it, but even our 3-year-old child walked out of his room in the middle of the night and explained how the chair was moving in his bedroom by itself, and he saw a ball of rainbow lights floating in his room. It sounds strange writing such a review on Google, but beware. The doors open by themselves, TVs don't work and randomly turn on by themselves in the middle of the night. Black clouds appear in the middle of the bedroom. Even ChatGPT started talking on our phone, saying it could see a little boy standing next to us. Later, it said it was not able to see things through the phone, and it must be a random glitch. We heard random loud screams in the middle of the night, so loud it sounded like someone being murdered, and footsteps going up and down your villa at 3 a.m. when you know everyone is asleep. These beings are interactive. According to the locals, the spirits of the mountain are angry and feel disrespected by the tourists and construction. There were a few members in our family who didn't believe in the energies, but were convinced that these events were supernatural. We had to check out halfway, as it was getting to be too much. Beware, and read about the haunted hotel in Uluwatu on Google, which is next door before you book here. Apart from that, the rooms are smelly and the service is poor. There is a construction happening next door, and we didn't get bath towels for 3 days after entering the hotel. All in all, we decided we were too scared to stay there, and we packed our stuff to leave. I remembered I'd left a couple of things on the table where the spoon was, and so I went to grab them before we ran out the door. As I approached the table, I noticed that the spoon was still on the table, but the creamer packet that the spoon was on top of earlier was on the floor, across from the table. We left and went back to Kangoo for our homestay. I know this sounds quite minor, but after we read the reviews, we knew we couldn't stay there as we were too freaked out. The weird thing is that aside from the review I found, we can't find anything else online about it, so I'm really intrigued as to whether anyone knows or has heard about this location or surrounding abandoned hotels or any perspectives from visitors in Bali and Indonesian or Balinese locals. I was in my old church in Connecticut, changing some light fixtures in an upstairs hallway. The Boy Scout troop who uses this space at night had reported footsteps before, but I thought nothing of it. I had a 6-foot ladder out with the new fixture on the paint step and 2 new 3-inch screws on the top step. As I reached up to take the bowl off the old fixture, I felt a poke in my chest, then heard a ding ding ding. I looked down, and one of the screws was on the top step, and the other was now rolling around in the new fixture below. I did not shake the ladder. I told it to scram and that I was busy. I've had encounters before, but not here, and I changed the fixture without further issue. I moved to the room next door and kept the lights off so that I could change some fluorescent tubes. While in the first fixture, the light adjacent flashed on and off 3 to 4 times. I did 2 more fixtures, and each time a nearby fixture would flash. I finally said, "Knock it off," and got out of there. A friend with abilities came through a few months later and made the comment that there was an angry man up there who doesn't want anyone in his space. Apparently this phantom had tried to scare me off. I work in a museum and also give guided tours in a nearby medieval prison in my town. It was built in 1524, and executions and torture took place there, so it has seen a lot of history and suffering over the centuries. The building itself is incredibly haunted, or at least it feels that way most days. We hear creaks coming from the floor, windows, and doors all the time, even when there is no wind and no one else in the building. Sometimes it sounds like footsteps, shifting just out of sight. There are also certain spots where the energy just feels off, like walking into a cold pocket of air. Most of us who work there have gotten used to it, but we still talk about it sometimes, especially after something unusual happens. You learn to just brush it off a lot of the time, but every now and then something happens that's harder to explain away. So there was this one time when I was standing alone in the middle of what we call the main cell area. It's a large open space with several old cells lining the walls, and the acoustics in there make even the smallest sound echo slightly. It was completely silent at the time, which made the whole place feel even more isolated. I remember checking the time and wondering where the group was, since they were a little late, and after a minute or two I turned around to see if they had maybe come in without me noticing, and that's when I saw it. Right near the doorway, just at the edge of my vision as I turned, a shadow figure passed by. It wasn't vague or shapeless. It had a clear human outline like a person walking quickly across the entrance. The movement was fast and smooth, almost like someone in a hurry trying not to be noticed. It crossed the doorway in less than a second, and then it was just gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the doorway, trying to process what I'd seen. I half expected someone to step back into view, or for the door to move, but everything stayed completely still. What surprised me the most was my reaction, though. I always thought if I ever experienced something like that, I'd be completely terrified, like heart racing, ready to run out the building. But I wasn't. I didn't feel scared at all. If anything, I was just kind of stunned and fascinated, like my brain was trying to catch up with what had just happened. I stayed there for another minute or so, just replaying it in my head, making sure I hadn't imagined it or misinterpreted a shadow from the outside. but the shape had been too clear, too defined. Eventually, I heard voices approaching from the entrance, and the tour group finally arrived. I shook it off, greeted them like normal, and went right back into my usual routine, explaining the history, pointing out the cells, talking about the executions and the stories tied to the place. The whole time, though, that moment stayed in the back of my mind. It didn't ruin the day or make me want to leave, but it definitely changed how I looked at that space. Since then, I have been a lot more aware when I'm in that area alone. Nothing that clear has happened to me again personally, but I am now more wary in case something else happens to me out there. I have never been a believer in ghosts or anything paranormal in nature for that matter, but this is something that isn't sitting right with me. When my mum told me the story of what happened and sent me the picture of what she saw, my heart honestly skipped a beat, and I have been unwell. So, my mum works in this hotel/restaurant up in Wisconsin. I live in Georgia. The restaurant is closed on Sundays and Mondays, and she was covering for someone on the hotel side until 11:30 p.m. She was cleaning and going in and out of the restaurant because that's where the coffee is, and she replaces the coffee every few hours, so the lights were still on. Well, she was just watching the cameras because she was expecting 2 check-ins, when all of a sudden something caught her eye from inside the restaurant. She immediately calls the guy that was going to be working starting at 11:30 to see if he could come right away, and was going to lock herself in the office, because apparently it shook her to her core. The guy came 4 minutes later, I guess because my mum was going to have a heart attack. This figure was still there, and even the guy saw it on the camera. So when they went into the restaurant, nothing was there. They looked everywhere, and when they went back to look at the camera, the figure was gone. I still feel bad for my mum. I don't know what it could be, but whatever it is, looks creepy as hell. Almost 20 years ago, I had a physical encounter with a ghost. This occurred at the old Spokane, Washington steam plant. Now a restaurant, the steam plant and grill, with a mini shopping area near the street. Back in the day, before modern heating systems, the steam plant provided heat and climate control to our old hospital. Think how Russia still heats their apartments in the city even today. When it closed, it was abandoned, but later it was declared a historic landmark and was revitalized with much old equipment kept intact. You can eat at the restaurant and tour around looking at the equipment used at the time, even go into one of the old cooling towers. Around 2005, my mum had a shop there for a bit. I was going to the local college after a summer in the forest service and was wearing a heavy jacket I earned helping with a fire. The thick collar was always crooked, and it drove my mum nuts. Personally, I felt like a rebellious young lady and let it be. Bring a good and proper young lady. While I struggled socially due to mild autism, my brain is good at picking up specific details, bits of odd info, and when I was younger, I was obsessed with ghosts, UFOs, and cryptic things in general. That and disasters and forensics. I wanted to see a ghost, see Bigfoot, and meet an alien. As I got older, I got more into the sciences and more logical, but a tiny bit of me still loved those topics. Anyway, that day I was helping my mum in her shop when I asked for a break to stretch my legs, plus I wanted to look around the historical markers and use them to help me talk to customers about the building's history. Usually nothing strange happened, except twice the restaurant accountant literally fled to my mum's shop, absolutely terrified because she claimed the ghost had touched her shoulder like it was looking over her shoulder as she worked on the computer. Mum usually gave her coffee to calm her nerves, and she refused to go back to work until her husband got there. Usually Mum just rolled her eyes and chuckled in private. She was terrified. Anyway, as I left, my mum once again nagged me more about my crooked coat collar. I rolled my eyes and left, but apparently something agreed with my mum that day. As on the second floor, I was reading a few displays when suddenly I could feel a hand grabbed the left side of my jacket collar, lift my whole winter coat up a few inches off my shoulder, and then set it back down like a very old, annoyed person, resulting in a near-perfect collar. Now, I have been pranked as a kid multiple times, and knew how to do a fast 360 spin on my heels. Immediately I spun around, and to my shock, there was no one near me. The closest person was about 40 feet away, calmly reading her own display. I immediately shouted out at her, confused, "Hey, did you just straighten my collar or see who did?" She looked at me bewildered. I then told her what happened, and she told me bluntly, "No, I was nowhere near you. Only you and we were up here." Her face suddenly grew pale, and she started stuttering, saying she had to go anyway. Her reaction confused me, until the memory of this poor restaurant accountant popped into my head. I too decided it was time to leave, and my mild autism kicked in hard. I had to report this to the authorities immediately. Flying down the stairs, it was clear that the police could not do anything. Spokane has no Ghostbusters, so I needed to report this to restaurant management. So I bolted to the restaurant and told the greeter up front that I had to talk to the manager now. Apparently, my look of fright convinced her to do exactly that. When he came out, he said he was rather busy, but asked what I needed, and I immediately told him what had transpired moments ago. The guy literally smiled, laughed, and then said, "Congratulations, you've just met the ghost." Seeing my confusion about his levity, he explained that apparently some think one old employee who worked here when it was still a steam plant never actually left after passing away. He was a benign spirit, never harming a soul, but he had this curiosity about new technology. Many employees and customers reported feeling a hand or presence on their shoulder, as if someone was looking over and asking, "What are you doing?" The same thing happened when working on desktop computers. Other people would see a human-shaped shadow moved along the surface or wall, but there'd never be a human body to go with it. Nothing bad ever happened. The ghost was just curious. While I processed this like a slow computer doing AOL dial-up, he patted me on the shoulder, thanked me for telling him what happened, but that he had to get back to the kitchen, but pausing, he admitted a heavy coat collar being fixed was a new one for the ghost before leaving. Still in an adrenaline state of shock, I went back to my mum's shop and told her what had happened. I expected to be mocked, but my religious mum admitted recently she sensed she had been watched once or twice. A recently installed picture by a new artist was creeping her out, since she swore she saw its eyes move a few times. At that point, I decided to quote the restaurant manager and told her, "Don't worry, the ghost has never harmed a living soul." Nothing ever happened after that. But a few weeks after, I was thrilled about my ghost experience. It was a relatively benign thing, considering most stories are usually scary and physically dangerous. As I worked at a castle hotel a few years ago, I was the unlucky fool who had 1 month of night shifts. The hotel was empty because of COVID. Only me and the janitor were there to look after the hotel. We had plenty of good and expensive rum, gin and whiskey, and other things people could steal, so we watched the hotel at night, and everyone who worked there was sure we had at least one ghost in the hotel. Well, one night at around 2 or 3, we sat in the office and just talked, or just sat there in silence, nothing special. Boring night shift. But not this night. We had the theory of the ghost, and as we sat there we heard footsteps on the 2nd floor. The floor was made of wood, so you could clearly hear when someone walked over it, especially because it was so quiet, and both of us looked confused. As we went upstairs looking for the source of the footsteps, as we had to be sure no one had gotten inside to steal something, we found nothing. No open windows, no broken doors, or anything else. Every room was still closed, but we could clearly hear those footsteps. Even our boss looked at the security videos the next day but found nothing. We even heard them a few more times, but never found anyone walking through the hotel. It was honestly the strangest thing. I managed an old historic boutique motel on the coast that was built in the late 1800s, and over the years it had passed through generations of the same family. Not long after I started, I met the great-great-grandson of the original owner. He came by occasionally and would sit with me, telling stories about the property. Some of the things he shared stuck with me more than I expected. He talked about a hidden tunnel somewhere on the grounds, used back in the early days for reasons he never fully explained. He also mentioned the number of deaths that had happened there over the years, guests, accidents, illness, things that just sort of piled up with a place that old. But the story that stayed with me the most was about a bride who had fallen out one of the upstairs windows on her wedding day. He didn't dramatize it, didn't try to make it sound scary, he just stated the facts. When I first started managing the place, my apartment on site was still being renovated, so they put me up in one of the upstairs suites temporarily. It was a beautiful room, but it had this large walk-in closet that always felt a little off. Inside the closet was a small old wooden door that led up to the attic. It looked like something out of a different era. Well, out of curiosity, we tried opening it a few times during the day, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it had been sealed shut for years. But one night everything changed. I was in the room with my daughter, and my dog was lying near the foot of the bed. Out of nowhere, she started growling low and deep. Her fur stood straight up along her back, and she was locked onto the closet staring. That alone was enough to wake my daughter. We both just sat there for a moment listening to the growl, trying to figure out what she was reacting to. But there was nothing else, no sound or movement, just the dog staring and growling at the closet door. We started arguing quietly about who was going to go check it out. Neither of us wanted to be the one to open it, but neither of us wanted to ignore it either. And then we didn't have a choice. That small attic door, one we hadn't been able to open at all before, suddenly flew open. It just snapped open with force. My dog completely lost it. She went from growling to full panic, scrambling towards the door out of the room, trying to get out. I don't think I've ever seen her get that scared before or since. My daughter started crying, and honestly I wasn't far behind. Whatever confidence I had about handling weird situations disappeared instantly. We didn't investigate, we didn't try and explain it, we simply left. And the next day we moved rooms. And from that point on, my dog refused to go upstairs in the building at all. You could try to lead her, call her, anything you wanted, but she would stop at the bottom and not go any higher. I worked there for years after that, and thankfully that was the only strange thing that happened. We had a security camera set up in the lobby, and the monitor for it was in my apartment. The lobby itself was set up like a cozy common area with couches, a big table where guests could sit and do puzzles or play games, and on that table was a handmade checkerboard crafted out of leather with large, heavy checker pieces. At night, after the lobby was closed and completely empty, I would sometimes hear the sounds of pieces being moved, like someone was actually playing a game. More than once I checked the camera when I heard it, and every time the lobby would be empty. There were plenty of other little things over the years too. Unexplained noises, things slightly out of place that constantly felt like you weren't completely alone. But the one thing I can't explain is the bride. It didn't happen often. A figure near the window, the one she supposedly fell from. You'd catch it out of the corner of your eye sometimes, if you looked directly. She'd still be there, but only for a moment. Working there, you learn to function around things you can't explain. But there's always that underlying weirdness. I'm glad I no longer work there. My family moved into a massive old house when I was 10. A cousin of mine was supposed to help us move in. He'd always been kind of eccentric, but nothing alarming. The honestly strange part was how he behaved the moment we arrived. He stood in the doorway for maybe 10 seconds just staring into the empty hall. Then he muttered something about forgetting he had other plans and just left. After that, he avoided the house completely. Be it birthday, holiday, family dinners, he never came, and we always teased him about it, and we joked that he must have seen a ghost. Somehow the imaginary ghost ended up with a name, Daniel. The joke stuck. If something went missing, we always said Daniel took it. A door creaked at night, it was Daniel. It was just dumb, harmless fun. That is, of course, until my little sister began talking. As soon as she was old enough to form sentences, she began saying things that made everyone uneasy. She'd ask my parents to close her bedroom door at night because she didn't like the boy walking in the hallway. She described him casually like it was obvious. He walks slowly. He just looks at me. We brushed it off as imagination. Kids say weird things, right? And now the Daniel joke suddenly began to feel less funny. When I was about 14, my parents decided to rip up the newer flooring to restore the original hardwood. Anyone who's been to an old house knows that it means lots of work. We were sitting on the floor in the process when we uncovered yellow sheets and a small article about a boy named Daniel that had lived in our house decades earlier. The piece was short, almost clinical. It mentioned that he had developmental disabilities and that he died in an accident near the property. The room went quiet in the uncomfortableness. No one said anything. The newspaper was a creepy coincidence, though, given that for years we had an ongoing joke about the ghost's name. And it wasn't for a long while after that when we finally messaged our cousin and asked him why he was so weird about our house, did he tell us that the moment he went into the threshold, he got this awful feeling, and that he decided he wasn't going to go in. One weekend I was at my parents' house. I was with my mother in the living room on the couch just talking. Suddenly I catch in the corner of my house something dark. It was pitch black. Not tall, short, didn't have a specific shape, not human shape. This thing jumped from that spot to another spot. I realized I just saw something. To understand the next part, I must explain the setup in my house. In the living room we had a big table, big enough to fit 12 people. And on that table my mother had a tablecloth. So after I saw that black thing jumping from that spot to the other spot, I looked at the tablecloth and saw it moving. I realized that what I just saw was real, and I started shaking and crying. I explained it to my mother and just tried to ignore it, as I could not do anything about it. After 3 days, my sister was in the bathroom. The bathroom is next to the living room, and I heard my sister screaming. I got curious and went to check on her. She came out screaming at me that we have a frog in the bathroom. I told her to calm down and that I would get rid of it. We grew up in the countryside, so I was used to frogs. I entered the bathroom, and as I saw the frog, I froze instantly. It was the largest frog I'd ever seen. It was huge, like a balloon. I began shaking and left. My mother had an acquaintance that was into odd stuff. They were not friends or anything, but she calls this woman and tells her about the frog. This woman told her to catch the frog and put it in a jar and close it, to keep it closed for 5 days, and if the frog doesn't die, she must go and leave it in the river. My mother did just that. The frog didn't die. I believed that the black thing I saw was the frog, but something was attached to the frog because the black thing was like the size of a 5-year-old. After this, nothing else happened. If you have any thoughts about what I'd seen, I'd love to hear it. My grandpa was somewhat into the paranormal, and he always said he would show signs from the other side before he passed. I grew up very close to my grandparents. I saw them nearly every day as a child, and think of them as my second parents. On the night before his funeral, I was trying to write a eulogy for him, and I wanted to use this paper I wrote on him in middle school. The assignment was to write about a character, and my grandpa absolutely fit that description. It got lost after many computer switches over the 20 plus years since I wrote it, and my mum had searched for it for years as well. Then that night, as I was trying to write, my mum suddenly gets an idea of where to look. She pulls a specific box out of her storage and rifles through it, pulling out a paper copy of the very assignment. We read it with much laughter and crying, and I wrote my eulogy copying the assignment on my computer with minor edits. It was as if she had pulled the paper out of thin air. I fully believe my grandfather told her where to find it. Before I got married, I visited my grandparents' graves several states away with my husband and introduced him to them. It was meaningful and symbolic to me, if nothing else. A year later, I eloped in Mexico, and on the Dia de Muertos, November 2nd, we had our wedding dinner at the resort restaurant, and we walked through the decorations the resort set up, including multiple ofrendas. As we stood in line, my husband was being affectionate as usual and said, "You're my licorice," which is not his usual nickname for me, Jellybean. He looked stunned for a second as if he didn't know why he said that nickname, then corrected himself to "You're my Jellybean." I asked him why he said that, and then he honestly said, "I don't know." That was my grandpa's nickname for me. I never told him that. Dia de Muertos is meant to be when the veil is at its most thin between the realm of the dead and those alive. And ofrendas are apparently a pathway for loved ones to visit us from the other side. Could it have been my granddad, whispering in his ear? Before I tell my story, I'll start by saying that I do believe in the supernatural, but I am a huge skeptic and don't think these things are as common as people are led to believe. I think most encounters are just people's imagination, or simply explainable occurrences. Now, with that being said, I'm pretty sure what I saw was real, but I would not be surprised to find out I was wrong. So, my cousin and I decided to visit Japan back in 2018 for one of those gigantic Groupon tours, and during this part of the tour, we were at some gigantic shrine. The area for the shrine was enormous, and we were given a few hours to explore. Note that during these types of tours, you're with a group of people around, 10 to 16, and everyone is grouped by 2, and you travel around your touring country via bus and tour guide. We had been walking around this huge property for a while now, and it was almost time for us to meet back at the bus, so we went down a path we hadn't taken yet, but we knew it led back towards the entrance. While heading down that path, there was a fork in the road, and the way going left led down an area with a gate. But the gate was open, so we figured it was allowed to go down there, and thought we'd quickly go down this path because we did have some time left over. While going down there, we saw some of the people who were on the bus with us coming back up the path, so we asked them what was down there. They said it was just some graves and stuff, and me and my cousin decided it wasn't worth it to see some graves, so turned around and headed back with our tour mates. Note, it was kind of overcast, and it would very lightly sprinkle rain every now and then. On our way back, there being about 6 of us in total, we see 2 women dressed in kimonos sitting on a bench in the middle of the field. Now, this bench is about 15 to a maximum of 25 feet away in this field, and is clearly not in the best condition. It seems worn down. Also, this field is about half dirt, half grass. That is to say, it's not like a soccer field where it's clearly primarily grass. This is my first time in Japan, and I've never seen anyone in a kimono before, so decide to take up my brand new Google Pixel phone and take some pictures of the nice scenery, and my cousin and the people were deciding to do the same. As I'm taking the pictures and checking them, I keep noticing that they're blurry and can't seem to get a good shot. I mention this to my cousin, and she says the same thing is happening to her, and it's only their faces that keep getting blurred. It was the same with me only the faces are blurred, and she was using the newest iPhone at the time. I made a comment about how it's kind of raining, so that's probably what caused it, and she agreed. Immediately after that, I hear one of the people we were with and his wife also complaining that their phones weren't taking pictures of the two women in kimonos, and they keep coming out blurry. This is when a chill went down my spine, because I told you in the beginning that I believe in the supernatural, but I'm highly skeptical of people's supposed encounters, and nothing like this has ever happened to me. But with that being said, I can't come up with a logical reason that these 4 people, one with a Google Pixel and 3 with iPhones, can't take clear pictures of 2 women about 20 feet away. Over the years, I keep trying to rationalize it, but I don't know, man. My dad is even more skeptical than I am about these things, and as soon as I told him this story, he instantly agreed that it might have been ghosts, because, in his words, those kind of things do happen out there. Also, the fact that what we thought only to be a shrine turned out to be a mass grave site didn't help matters. Before you ask, my cousin and I deleted the pictures because we both were kind of freaked out. So what do you think? Am I just overreacting? Could it have been a glitch on multiple people's phones? Something wrong in the area? The rain maybe? Or might there have been a more spooky explanation to this? I went out with some friends one night, and somehow we ended up deciding to try one of those ghost apps called GhostTube. I'd never used anything like that before, and honestly, I didn't take it seriously. It felt more like something to mess around with than anything real. We started at a cemetery, figuring if the app was going to do anything, it would be there. For a while, nothing really happened. Just a few random words popping up that didn't connect to anything. That actually made me more skeptical. It felt exactly like what I expected. After a bit, we left and got back in the car. And that's when things started to feel weird, because the app didn't stop. Even as we pulled away from the cemetery, it kept lighting up, going red, beeping, acting like it was still picking something up. At first, we laughed it off, assuming it was just glitching or maybe reacting to movement or signal changes. But then I pointed my phone towards the trunk of the car. It immediately went red. And that's when the mood changed. We started testing it, moving the phone around the car. The signal would drop back to normal until I aimed it at the trunk again, and every time without fail it lit up. At that point we started talking to it, not because we fully believed it, but because we were curious. The words it gave us didn't make anything better. Most of them were random, but a few stood out. Jeremy, you are annoying. That one actually made us laugh for a second out of nerves, but that kept going. Satan, niece, van, pathetic. None of it formed a clear message, but it didn't feel completely random either. It was just enough to make you start connecting dots. And after I dropped my fence off, I expected everything to go back to normal, but it didn't. I was alone parked outside my house and I checked it again and got the same result. As long as I pointed my phone anywhere else, nothing happened. But the moment I aimed it at the trunk, it lit up red again. That's when it really got to me. I got out the car and walked around it, scanning everything. Doors, windows, under the car, nothing. It only ever triggered when it was by the trunk. I started thinking about the car itself. I had bought it used, and before that, it had been a rental. A lot of people had driven it, used it, and left things behind. My brain kept trying to come up with some kind of story, something that would explain why the trunk specifically was the only place to trigger a response. But there was nothing concrete. I went inside, but curiosity didn't go away, and after a while I checked the app again just to see if anything had changed. 2 words popped up. Certainly, demonic. That was enough for me. Whatever was happening, whether it was the app glitching or environmental interference or just my brain trying to make patterns of the randomness, I decided I had had enough and closed the app. And I haven't tried to communicate with it since. Has anyone else experimented with these kind of apps? My wife Jane and I had a true encounter at the Cecil Hotel in the 1980s. As a young married couple from New York vacationing in Los Angeles, California, for several days without knowing its dark history. Now, the Cecil Hotel opened in 1924 downtown, with 14 floors and many rooms, built first as a luxurious spot for wealthy travelers passing through. Due to the Great Depression, homelessness, and its spot near Skid Row, it quickly turned into a notorious hub for crime, people taking their own lives and mysterious deaths, earning nicknames like Hotel Death and the Suicide Hotel. That was when men and women down on their luck ended their lives there, often alongside folks with psychiatric issues and drug addictions, seeking others in the same mess, living rough inside. In 2011, it was renamed to Stay on Main, to shake up the bad reputation, tied to murderers, serial killers like Richard Ramirez, who stayed and killed nearby in 1985, Jack Unterwagen in 1991, and as recently as 2013, the Elisa Lam mystery. We checked into the front desk, not knowing any of the history. Not until we researched it later. The clerk handed us the key to room 13, but when we saw the number, we told him we were superstitious and both felt like it was bad luck straight off. So he took the key back and instead gave us the key to room 903 on a higher floor, saying it boasted a nice view of LA. With that, the young bellhop grabbed our luggage and took it upstairs by elevator. One of two old Otis elevator company ones still running smoothly. That was when I remembered that this was the early 1980s, so most hotels used metal keys for rooms, not plastic cards that came later. We stepped into our room, 903, finding it small but nice looking overall, holding that 1930s vintage style. My wife Jane and I found the persistence of the older style pretty cool, since we appreciated vintage. The room felt nice at first, but we found it strange and kind of unsettling how the room came painted blood red with big, glowing, blinking lights already on when we walked in. That was when Jane turned them off quickly, unable to handle the eerie blink going constantly, as neither of us were able to handle the eerie blink consistently. The first night and day at the Cecil Hotel passed fine, without a single odd thing crossing our minds or sleep. The night after that, when we were in bed, I saw Jane tossing and turning restlessly until she woke up with a start, sitting right up, holding her neck in fear of shaking. So she told me she felt hands around her neck that were tight, like someone was trying to choke her while she slept deeply there. I knew she was not joking around, from the real fear in her eyes was staring wide back at me. That's when I hugged her close and told her everything would be fine. Now, I'm not psychic, but I have a good sixth sense about places, and something about the hotel seemed a bit off from the moment I arrived. Jane and I went back to sleep after calming down. We were only asleep about an hour or so, when a rattling hit our door like someone was trying to break inside. I woke up fast and approached the door steadily, looking out the peephole, finding no one standing in the hallway. That was when, just as I turned back to bed disappointed, I saw a hotel bellboy in vintage uniform come down the hall through the peephole. Red hat, red coat, and then he turned the corner and was out of sight. I got out of the room quickly, still in pajamas, wanting to complain to him about all the noise outside our door so late, and when I turned the corner, there was no bellboy anywhere down the empty passage. That's when I knew it sounded far-fetched and crazy even to me, and I planned not to tell my wife after her choking scare. But since she faced that mysterious spirit in bed, it did not seem so wild to share what passed my view, and I told her of the phantom bellboy, We agreed that if anything else out of the ordinary happened, we would check out first thing in the morning. Our next couple of days at the Cecil Hotel were fine and without trouble. And on our last night there, after a nice dinner out, we returned, putting the hotel key in the door, opening it, and being shocked to see a young female pacing inside our room. She appeared to be in her late 20s with blue eyes and long golden hair, and looked like she was waiting for someone to arrive. We couldn't hear a sound come from her mouth, but her lips were moving. That's when she suddenly opened her eyes wide, terrified, and before we knew it, was gone, vanished completely. My wife and I could not make heads or tails of the situation, but decided to sleep there and check out of the hotel in the morning. While in bed, we started to hear faint sounds of a couple arguing. It was in the walls. The man sounded older and tough, and the female sounded young and sweet, crying. That was when we heard the slapping sounds, and then a knock at what sounded like the next door over of a young bellboy asking if everything was all right and that there was a lot of noise. We heard an angry, gruff man's voice reply that everything was fine. The arguing continued after the bellboy left, and then a huge crash of the window breaking, like someone trying to jump out of it. We think it was the young lady's spirit fretting earlier, and this was a replay of the horror she endured and the manner of which she decided to leave our world. We checked out first thing in the morning. My wife Jane and I researched New York City Library, finding the story of a young lady who jumped to the 9th floor and was 27 years old, Miss Pauline Otten, in October of 1962, arguing with her estranged husband Dewey, landing on innocent 65-year-old transient George Gianni, killing both instantly. So police first assumed it was a suicide pact, but he had his hands in his pockets, so it was unlikely. All in all, it was a creepy experience, and we never went back to that place. In my life, I have reluctantly had random occurrences of seeing, sensing, and hearing from or dreaming about people who have died. It's jarring and unwelcome. I won't share every experience here, but I will open up about my recent predicament that I'm seeking guidance on. We brought a lovely home from a couple that chose us for the property because of our environmental and farming values. The man built it by hand when he was in his 20s, now in their 70s, and they had to move closer to services since his dementia was progressing. He died this February. His wife and I had written to each other over the 5 years of living here. She invited us to the funeral so that we could learn more about the incredible person who built our house. At the service, the wife told a story that she saw her husband's form in their living room a few days after his death, staring at her and looking at peace. It was very heartfelt and real to her. Recently, I have seen an occasional form in our home that I often confuse with being my husband. I have seen a cat here since we've moved in, and we joked that when this man died, he'd visit the home. Well, it is clearly now the case. Any guidance? I always shut myself off when I feel or see a spirit, but this was a good man. Does anyone have any guidance? I really would like this man to move on. Good evening all and welcome. A prominent member of our community, Scooby, has recently suffered a truly devastating personal tragedy. I hope you can join me in the comments section wishing her well, and I'd like to let you know, Scooby, that we're all here for you if you need us. And to Maltese Mike, I hope your recovery goes well. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Okay, so before I start this story, I would like to give you some context. I grew up in a town called Luther, Michigan, in the middle of Manistee Forest. I'm talking about a population of 300 people. I lived with my grandpa at the time, and we lived in a small one-bedroom cabin that he built deep in the woods. And to even get to it, you needed to drive down a 2-mile two-track. So needless to say, unless you knew who my grandpa is or your family, no random person is going to accidentally walk into our front yard out there. So, now that I painted the picture, let me tell you the story. I must have been about 7 or 8 years old or so. As I said, it was a small one-bedroom cabin. So my bedroom was actually the living room, and we had this giant window looking out to the front area of the house. During the day, you could see the driveway, the shed, my grandpa's project cars and trucks, and various farm stuff we had. But at night, it was pitch black, like someone had put a dark blanket over the entire house. My bed was positioned right up against the window, so I'd be sleeping right next to this window. And as I said, it's a small space, so I'd curl up with my back against the window and fall asleep. Now, I was a pretty heavy sleeper as a kid, so I'd be out the whole night. Well, one night after I said my prayers and got ready for bed, my grandpa tucked me in and sat by the fire to read his Bible. Most nights he'd read his Bible till I fell asleep, then go back and go to sleep himself in his room. And this night was no different. He got into his chair, took out his Bible, and started to read, so I slowly fell asleep. I must have been asleep for maybe 3 or 4 hours when I woke up. My grandpa fell asleep in the chair, and my back was hurting, so I turned around on my other side. So now my face was staring out the window, and as I was just about to close my eyes and go back to bed, I swear I saw a silhouette of what looked like a man standing right outside the window. Keep in mind, it was already pitch black out there, so this means he would have to have been standing inches from the glass. At first, I thought I was seeing things, so I blinked a few times, and it was still there. I remember feeling super scared, and I don't move. Maybe I thought if I didn't move, whoever it was would think I was asleep and just leave. But the shadow didn't leave. And once my eyes adjusted, I could in fact make out a man with stubble standing practically right against the glass. I did not move. The man then drew down his face so it was level with mine, and looked right at me. I started crying so bad I was shaking in fear, and the noise woke my grandpa. When my grandpa got out of his chair, the man took off running into the woods. My grandpa came over and started to rub my back and asked what was wrong. I told him what I saw. Now, I had a rough childhood, and if I lied to anyone, I'd get my ass beat, so he knew I wouldn't make this up. My grandpa turned on the house lights, went into his room, and came out with a shotgun and went outside. He was probably outside for 10 minutes. But I can tell you, those were the longest 10 minutes of my life. He came back, and his face was spooked. My grandpa was a Green Beret in Vietnam. He doesn't scare like that at all. But I can tell you that he looked freaked out. He came over to me and said he'd stay out with me tonight and even let me watch TV all night, which he never let me do. And the whole night he sat facing the front door of the cabin, shotgun in hand. When morning came, the first thing he did was put curtains up all over the walls. Then we went outside. Sure enough, there were footprints in the dirt, leading out into the deep woods. After that, I wasn't allowed to play in the woods alone anymore, and Grandpa moved my bed away from the woods. Now, about a week or so later, my grandpa was watching the news after dinner, and there was a story about a recently escaped prisoner that was found near the Becky Trail outside Luther. The 2 tracks that led to my cabin were the Becky Trail. He was hiding out in a hunting shack about a mile away from where we were. To this day, being left alone in the woods at night scares the ever-loving crap out of me. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and not long ago I went through a divorce that forced me to leave Orlando and move with my 2 young boys to my family's farm, about 18 miles outside of Valdosta, which you can say qualifies as the middle of nowhere. I had never dealt with anything truly frightening before, and at the time, I believed I was stepping into a slower life pace. The house we moved into had been in my family for years, but it was in rough shape, an enormous aging farmhouse with 8 bedrooms and a separate mother-in-law suite. Most of it honestly was untouched and needed serious work. When we first arrived, only 2 rooms were livable, and over the next 9 months we slowly worked through the rest, cleaning, repairing, and trying to make it feel like home. The layout of the house was unusual, built in a wide U shape with a courtyard in the center, and I chose a bedroom that faced inward towards that enclosed space, thinking it would be the safest spot for me and my boys. One of the first things our neighbor across the street, called Jay, did was help fence in that courtyard so my kids could play without wandering too far. At the time, it felt like a kindness that I would never be able to repay. From the beginning, Jay made himself part of our daily lives, always appearing while he was supposedly tending to his animals across the road, offering help with repairs, tools, or anything else we needed. He came by almost every day, and over time I came to see him as nothing more than a generous, middle-aged neighbor, someone reliable. He refused payment most of the time, brushed off any attempt I made to compensate him, and never once gave me a reason, at least on the surface, to feel uncomfortable, because of how secluded the house was, set far back from the road, with my bedroom window facing that fenced courtyard. I didn't even bother putting up curtains in my bedroom or bathroom. It never crossed my mind that anyone would or could be watching. The first crack in that sense of safety came from something so small I almost ignored it completely. One afternoon, while my son was playing under the carport, Jay pulled into the driveway and looked at my car. And before he even made it over, my oldest casually told me, "I saw him under our window last night." The comment stopped me for a moment, but I brushed it off, assuming he had seen Jay near the property line where the horse pasture was visible from the kitchen window. Later that night, when I asked him about it again, he insisted he had seen someone outside, but I convinced myself there must have been a logical explanation. Looking back, I realized I wanted to believe in the version of Jay that I had already created in my head, so I ignored what didn't fit. Other things happened too, things that felt strange but not alarming enough on their own to trigger real fear. One day I came home and found my favorite candy sitting in the fridge, and my mum mentioned she must have told Jay something about it in passing. Then for weeks I received flowers every Friday from an anonymous sender. I assumed it was either my ex-husband or my boyfriend at the time, but neither of them would admit to it. My boyfriend even joked that maybe it was Jay. But then I laughed it off because the idea seemed ridiculous. One afternoon, I came home from school to find Jay working on my car under my carport while my mum watched the boys. He told me he found the issue with my air suspension and asked if I wanted to see it, so I leaned over the hood to look. As I did, he stepped back, and when I turned around, I noticed he was holding an old flip phone, one of those early models with a camera. I made a joke about how outdated it looked, and he just smiled. Later that evening, my mum told me she thought she saw him take a picture of me in that moment, but I dismissed it immediately. It sounded paranoid, and I wasn't ready to admit that anything was wrong. A few weeks later, everything changed. I was mowing the courtyard, trying to get it under control after it had grown wild, and as I passed near my bedroom window, I noticed something that made my stomach drop instantly. Sitting just outside the windows and beneath my bathroom window were cinder blocks that hadn't been there before, positioned perfectly like steps. I can't explain how I knew in that exact moment, but something inside me changed forever, and every excuse that I had made for Jay over the past few months collapsed in on themselves. I called my friend and neighbor Josh, who came over immediately. When he saw the blocks, he didn't hesitate. He ran home, grabbed a deer cam, and mounted it to a tree facing my windows. It was still daylight, around 3 in the afternoon, but neither of us felt right about waiting. That night, just after 6, I got home with my boys and started unloading the car, when suddenly I realized someone was standing behind me. I turned, startled, and saw Jay. He smiled casually and said he didn't mean to scare me, then mentioned he heard my mom was out of town. I knew he already knew that. Small town and social media made sure of it, but hearing him say it out loud made my skin crawl. He told me to call him if I needed anything, especially if I got scared. I nodded, trying to stay calm, and got the boys inside. Later that night, after the kids had fallen asleep in my bed, I went into my mum's room to watch TV and decompress, texting my ex about the boys and a show that I had missed. At exactly 9:02 p.m, Josh called me. His voice was urgent, and the first thing he asked is if my boyfriend was over. When I said no, he told me there was a man outside my window and that the deer cam had just captured him. That's when everything inside me went ice cold. Josh told me not to panic, that he was already driving up and that I needed to meet him on the opposite side of the house. I hung up, forced myself to move as quietly as possible, and walked to my bedroom where my boys were sleeping, and gently scooped them up. The moment I stepped back into the hallway, I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran through the house and out the other side until I reached his truck, and we stayed there until the police arrived. The camera had captured images from 9:02, 9:22 and 9:30. He had been standing outside my window for nearly half an hour waiting. Behind the house stretched a massive produce field with a narrow tractor path leading in and out, and when officers searched the area, they found evidence of where he had been parking, but of course he was already gone. I showed them the photos and identified Jay. He was arrested at 2 in the morning. When they searched his phone, they found 9 months worth of pictures, hundreds of them, of me. Mowing, playing with kids, standing in my kitchen, inside my bathroom, even sleeping. Moments I didn't know anyone was watching. Moments that were supposed to be private. The image that stayed with me the most was one taken while I was bent over the hood of my car. He hadn't been helping me. He had been perving. After he was arrested, things got even worse. Within a week, he was released on bail, and not long after that, he walked into the post office where my mum worked and calmly told her he had found my dog, Ollie, dead, shot in the head, and that he had already buried him for me. That way he said it so casually, almost like he expected gratitude. Ollie had loved him. Jay had spent months gaining his trust, bringing treats and leftovers, even carrying him around and talking to him, taking him along when he went to feed the animals. Ollie would run up to him, jump into his arms without hesitation. Thinking about that now and how my dog must have felt in those final moments, confused and trusting, makes me feel sick. The police searched his property and found where he had buried him, covered carefully with concrete and a rock. He was charged again, this time with animal cruelty on top of everything else. Despite it all, stalking, trespassing, being a peeping Tom, the photos, and killing my dog, he only received 5 years of probation and a restraining order. But in a small town, word spread fast, and while the community shunned him, shaming him, and cutting him off, even forcing him to avoid local places, none of that changed the fact he still lived across the street. I stayed there for 3 more months, surrounded by friends who took turns sleeping at the house, and who bought me protection, and made sure I knew how to use it. But honestly, the feeling of being watched never went away. It got to the point where I just packed up and left, and moved to Fort Walton Beach, putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. Even now, what haunts me the most isn't what he did. It's how easily he became someone I trusted, and how normal he seemed while he was quietly invading every aspect of my life. I can't help but wonder, how many things did he see? How much of me that I didn't want to share with the world did he steal from me without my consent? To quote the children, it gives me the ick, and I never want to go back. This happened back in 1982, during a stretch of early winter that felt colder and quieter than usual, even for rural Maine. My cousin and I had made plans to head north on the Canadian Pacific Railway during the first week of deer season, since at that time the season opened earlier, above the tracks than it did further south. It was something we had been looking forward to for months. A chance to get away from everything and spend time deep in the woods, where the only sound came from the wind, wildlife, and the occasional distant echo of a train. We were driving along a long, isolated road that ran between Bingham and Abbott, a stretch of roughly 25 miles that felt like it existed completely outside the rest of the world. Even back then, there were no houses or gas stations or signs of life for miles in either direction. It was still dark when we set out that morning. About halfway through that stretch, we noticed something ahead of us that immediately felt out of character. There was a small, narrow beam of light, shining straight upwards from the center of the road, like a thin column cutting through the darkness. At first, it didn't even register as a flashlight because it was positioned so perfectly upright that it almost looked staged, like it had been placed there for someone to find intentionally. As we got closer, we realized, in fact, it was a flashlight, sitting upright in the middle of the road, with its beam pointing directly into the sky. My cousin slowed the truck down, clearly intrigued, and said he was going to stop and get out to grab it. Something about that idea immediately set me on edge in ways I can't explain. It wasn't just that it was strange to find a flashlight in the middle of nowhere, it was how deliberate it looked, like it had been placed there for reasons we yet didn't know. I told him not to stop the truck. I said if he really wanted it, I could just open the door and grab it as we rolled by slowly, but without ever fully stopping. And after a brief hesitation, he agreed, probably sensing that something about the situation felt off, even if he didn't want to admit it outright. As we eased past the light, I leaned out of the passenger side, keeping one hand braced against the door while I reached down and grabbed the flashlight in one quick motion. The moment I pulled it, I shut the door, and my cousin accelerated, and that's when we saw it. Almost immediately after we passed the spot, lights began appearing on both sides of the road behind us. Several scattered along the tree line where moments before there had been nothing but inky darkness. I turned around in my seat. There were people standing on both sides of the road, partially hidden among the trees, each holding a light. They hadn't been visible at all until we passed the flashlight, and now they were just watching us. My cousin slowed down for a second, almost like he couldn't believe his eyes. We both stared back at them through the rear window. None of them moved towards the road, and none of them tried to stop us. But the way they stood there spaced out and waiting made it clear that something nefarious had been planned. And if it wasn't for our quick grab-and-go maneuver, they very well would have ambushed us. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they began to fade back into the woods, as if they'd never been there at all. Neither of us made any comments about it after that. My cousin pressed the gas and kept driving, and we didn't stop anywhere along that road for the rest of the trip. The flashlight sat on the floor beneath us, still on. I've thought about that moment many times over the years. I know it was some kind of setup. They wanted to stop someone in the middle of nowhere, hoping they'd get out of the truck, distracted and exposed, assuming there was no one else out there, only to steal the truck at best, or do something far more insidious at worst. A story on the news, no doubt. Someone driving in the middle of nowhere with their truck left. That is, of course, the best case scenario, and them disappeared. Who really knows, though? I'm glad we never got to find out. I grew up in a rural area near the border, and this was back in the late 80s, and there were still checkpoints and patrols scattered around the countryside at that point, and it was for that reason that certain parts of the land always felt weird. One of our back fields, about half an hour walk from our farmhouse, was one of these places. The fence back there was always getting damaged. Sometimes it looked cut, other times just pulled apart. My father sent me out one afternoon to fix it before we moved cattle in, and I remember whining about it the whole way, more annoyed at the walk than anything else. When I got there, I saw the break right away. Near the far corner on the other side of the fence was our neighbor's land, and sitting in it was an old abandoned hay shed that no one had used for as long as I could remember. As I started fixing the wire, I heard a low, muffled sound coming from the shed. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a sheep stuck inside, or something caught in the debris. The sound didn't stop though. It wasn't random, it had a rhythm to it. So I climbed over the fence and walked towards the shed. The hedges around it blocked most of the light even in the afternoon, and the inside was dim. But one side of the shed was open. I was afraid to get in because the air itself was rancid in there, and when my eyes adjusted, I saw someone standing in the far corner with their back turned to me. Whoever they were was wearing a white shirt and a dark skirt, and had long, black hair. She was moving, but not walking. It was like shifting in place with repetitive movement, like pacing without going anywhere. And the sound that I had been hearing was coming from her, this constant mumbling. I froze on the spot. I felt like I shouldn't have seen this. I had stepped into something I wasn't meant to witness. But I didn't say anything. I was transfixed staring at her. Then the mumbling stopped, and the movement, and I don't know how to explain it, but at that moment, she was aware of me. I turned and ran. I don't remember climbing the fence, just being on the other side and running all the way back to the farmhouse. My father didn't believe me at first and said it was my imagination and that I'd worked myself up over nothing. But I must have been shaken, or at least looked it, because after a while he agreed to come back with me. He brought a flashlight and a hammer, and we walked all the way back up. Of course, at this point the shed was empty, with no sign of anyone ever being there. But when my father shone the light across the dirt floor, we both saw the marks, and they weren't footprints. No, hoof prints. Impressions in the dirt, like someone had been standing there for a long time. We left quickly after that. My father didn't say much on the walk back, and whenever I bring it up now, he still insists there was nothing there. My grandma says it could have been a banshee. My girlfriend and I took a 2-week road trip last year, and backwards camped and hiked the whole time. I'm also a girl, so we're two 20-something-year-olds out on the road. We got to one free campsite in the middle of nowhere, and we were the only people there, which wasn't unusual, so we took the first spot and set up. While we were making dinner, a couple pulled in, drove past us, and headed towards the back of the campground. No idea how far back it went. About 20 minutes later, they came back and flagged me down. The girl looked uneasy, like she was trying to play it off but couldn't. She asked if we'd been back there. I said no. She told me it looked like a massacre, bones everywhere, and asked if they could take the spot next to us. I said sure. For a moment it actually felt better knowing someone else was there. They stayed maybe 2 minutes, looked around, got back in their car, and then left, without another word. I told my friend what she had said, and right then we both noticed a huge femur bone lying almost at our feet. It looked like a cow bone and quite old, but still, instead of taking that as a sign to leave, we decided to go check it out. About 100 yards back through the winding campsite, we found it. Carcasses everywhere, some scattered, while others were still mostly intact. There was a pile that looked like fox fur and another deer body still inside a trash bag. It didn't make sense at first, but later we figured out it might be a place where roadkill gets dumped. Still, standing there it didn't feel all that normal. So many bodies in one place. We decided that that would be enough for the night, so packed up and left. The second campsite was even deeper in the middle of nowhere. We drove for about an hour without seeing a single car. There were no houses or lights on these old country roads, and the sun was already starting to set. Eventually the road turned to dirt, and we crossed a cattle gate and saw a national park sign. It felt like a relief. At least it was something official. The map said the campsite was about 2 miles in. I turned off and started up the road. It quickly got rough. The brush on both sides thickened, dead and grey, pressing in closer the higher we climbed. The road was full of rocks and trenches, completely wrong for the car we were in. A low-clearance Ford Focus that had absolutely no business being there. About 1/4 of a mile in, we got hung up on a rock. The underside scraped hard, loud enough to make both of us freeze. There was no room to turn around or space to back out, so we kept going, but it only got worse. Every few feet the car would scrape again, stutter, struggle forwards, and the sun disappeared behind us and the road seemed to get narrower and darker. The brush looked lifeless, almost skeletal in the fading light, and we just focused on getting through it without saying much. After what felt like forever, we reached the top. The campsite was barely anything, a tiny clearing maybe 10 feet across surrounded by dead brush, and right in front of us a cliff that drove off into total darkness. We sat there, neither of us wanted to get out, it didn't feel like a place people stayed, and decided to leave immediately. Turning our car around on that tiny patch, with the cliff inches away, took everything we had. Once we got pointed back down, we crept down the road as slowly as possible, and every scrape and jolt making it worse. The damage to the car, all for turning around. At some point, probably halfway, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Not just the absence of animals, but the no wind or insects or anything. And that's when I saw off the side of the road, between the dead brush. At first I thought it was just a shape, but it didn't move like a plant. It was tall. A few moments later, my friend shifted in her seat, like she had seen it too, but didn't want to confirm it. We didn't look directly at it, but as we kept going I had this growing feeling that we weren't passing it. It was keeping its pace. Every time the headlights swept across the brush, there was the suggestion of it again. Closer, reappearing where it shouldn't have been able to get to that fast. By the time we reached the bottom and crossed the cattle gate, both of us were gripping our seats so hard our hands hurt, and neither of us spoke until we hit the paved road. We drove for 2 more hours straight to the nearest town, and ended up sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. Neither of us brought it up that night. The next morning while we were getting ready to leave, my friend finally said something. She asked if I had seen it, and I said I had. She went quiet for a moment, and then said something. She said the first time she noticed it, it wasn't off the road. It was standing behind the car in the middle of the trail when we stopped at the top, watching us before we even turned around. And when we started driving down, she said she looked back one last time through the rear window. It hadn't stayed on the hill at all, but followed us down. Last weekend we were camping up in northern Maine, Baxter State Park, and I had a really weird experience. The night itself was eerie, pouring rain and lots of creepy noises. I and the 3 people I had been camping with many times are no strangers to noises or animals. Well, around 3 a.m, we were woken up by foxes screaming. Shortly after, my friends, in a separate tent, asked if we saw the light, to which I replied no, I did not see any light. I didn't think much of it and tried to close my eyes. Moments later, I heard them scurry out of their tents and into their car. I went over to chat. They were terrified. They said a light flashed 5 or 6 times directly into their tent. Again, I and my fiancée in the tent with me saw absolutely nothing, and our eyes were wide open. And our tent was positioned above in a lean-to and behind theirs. Any light at that time of night we should have seen. They were both adamant they saw the light flash from in front of their tent, which was facing the back of the campground and no road/people for miles. We got in the car and drove around until sunrise. The next morning we investigated. We went to the area where the light came from and there were no trails or camps or nothing. I even looked at the map to see if there could have been a car in the distance. But no. Then we saw something concerning. At the back of the campsite there was a small hill leading into the woods. There was a rat dug in the ground, looking fresh, and looking as if someone dug it out with a boot. It was the size of a shoe, maybe bigger. With the wind and rain, if it was older than the previous night, it should have had leaves blown in or around it. Anyway, we were spooked. It was just odd. I've never had anything like this happen. Does anyone have any ideas on what it might have been? This story has stuck with me for years. Back when I was studying with a friend in a remote part of the Andes in southern Peru, his family owned a stretch of land that used to sit near old silver and tin workings from decades ago. Most of the mines had been abandoned long before either of us were born, but locals still talked about them. Well, one afternoon, we took a couple of horses out to ride along the hills to kill time. The terrain out there is made of dry glass and scattered rock. You don't see another person for miles. Eventually, we spotted a ridge that looked like it would give a decent view of the valley, so we rode up towards it. And that is when we found the mine. It wasn't marked or fenced off, just a jagged opening in the earth, half hidden by collapsed stone and brush. It turns out there were multiple entry points, and of course, we went in. Inside, it branched into narrow tunnels and uneven chambers. Some dropped off into darkness, while others curved out of sight. We were messing around, exploring, until we came to a different section. At the back of one passage, the ground opened up. To our left was a vertical shaft that dropped at least 40 meters straight down. Even with what little light we had, we could barely make out the bottom. To the right, there was a shallow pit filled with loose stones and debris. Lying, half buried in the rocks, was a crude human shape. It was an effigy made from tightly wound strips of clear plastic. It was shaped just enough to be unmistakable. Around its waist was tied a strip of blue fabric. It looked like it had been torn from a miner's uniform. Growing up here, you do hear that the Quechua people in the region have stories about offerings and about leaving things behind in places where people had suffered. I'm not saying I fully believed it, but standing there looking at it, I was feeling quite unnerved. I didn't touch the thing. I just scrambled out of the pit as quickly as I could and nearly slipped on some of that loose rock I mentioned. Well, after a few minutes of trying to laugh it off, we decided to circle around and check the lower levels of the mine. There was another entrance further down the slope that led to the base of that vertical shaft we'd seen from above. Getting there took longer than expected, and by the time we found the opening, the light was already starting to fade. Inside, it was colder, and we followed the tunnel until it opened into a wider chamber, and then we realized exactly where we were. We were standing at the bottom shaft, and directly beneath it, there was a large, dark stain spread across the ground. Even in the low light, you could tell it wasn't just dirt. It covered a wide area, maybe 2 meters across, and soaked deep into the earth and rock. Scattered around it were scraps of blue fabric, similar to the kind around the effigy, and bones. Not a full skeleton, just fragments and shapes half buried in dust, but neither of us said anything. We had very little light, and were rather spooked by the scene, so we hightailed it out of there and never returned. We got out as fast as we could, barely speaking until we were back outside and on the horses once more. On the ride back, my friend finally confided something. He told me that some locals believed the place to be cursed, and they made offerings to transfer something onto someone else. I am confident this is the result of someone being killed and disposed of, or someone killing themselves due to their superstitious beliefs. Like, I am cursed, therefore I will/must die. Considering this area still had wildlife making its way through it, I can undoubtedly be sure that they would make quick work of cleaning up the body after the deed. But make that what you will. This happened a few years ago when my family and I travelled out into the rural areas surrounding Lviv. We were trying to find the small village where my grandfather was born. It was a place that hardly showed up on any of the old maps. While the further we drove, the emptier everything became. Paved roads turned into dirt paths, houses grew sparse, and eventually it was just open land stretching in every direction. At one point we stopped near a wide, empty field to walk around and try and get our bearings. It looked completely ordinary. Flat land, uneven ground, patches of grass and dirt. Nothing immediately stood out. We spread out a bit, wandering without thinking much of it, and that was when I tripped. I caught my foot on something and stumbled forward, annoyed, assuming it was just a root or rock sticking out the ground. But when I turned around, I saw it clearly. A rubber boot, half buried in the dirt at an awkward angle. It looked like it had been there for years. I pointed it out to the others, and at first it didn't seem like a big deal, just trash. But then I told everyone to look around. And it wasn't just one. There were shoes everywhere. A boot here, a worn sneaker there. The longer you looked at the landscape, the more you started to notice. Half buried across the entire field, scattered without any pattern, were hundreds, if not thousands of shoes. It didn't make sense. There was no house nearby, no dump site, no reason for this many shoes to be out here, let alone partially buried. That's when one of the older locals who had been helping us navigate earlier said he hadn't walked far into that field, just stood near the edge and told us not to go any further. At first we assumed it was something simple, like unstable ground, but then he explained that people from nearby areas knew about the place, and during certain periods or conflicts, prisoners and undesirables were taken there and never returned. There were no graves or markers, but he didn't go into detail about what happened there, and he didn't have to. Because once you hear that, you start noticing things you didn't before. How some shoes are positioned like they were slipped off in a hurry, how others were still paired side by side, and how certain parts of the ground looked more uneven. We didn't say much after that. No one really spoke as we walked back to the car, and even on the drive back we stayed quiet. I remember looking back one last time before we left. The field just looked like an ordinary field, and I think that's what made it worse. Nothing about it warned you what had happened there. This happened years ago. We were in a convoy of tourist vans heading back from a day tour in Palenque, making the long mountain drive towards San Cristobal de las Casas. The tour had run quite late, as they sometimes do, and by the time we left the ruins it was already getting dark. By the time we were deep in the mountains it was pitch black. There were 4 vans in total, spaced out along the winding road, each one packed with tired tourists. Most people had started off chatting or dozing, but as the road climbed higher and the jungle thickened around us, and phones lost signal as well as GPS, everyone started to feel sleepy and quiet. Even the driver seemed to rely purely on memory as the road twisted through the mountains, with no lights or signals. Inside our van were 5 of us near the back, including a couple of Italian tourists who had been excited and talkative all day. By this point they had gone quiet, occasionally glancing out the window like they were expecting to see something move out there. Then the first van braked, and the ripple effect followed, each van slowing one after another until we were crawling forwards, but none of us could see why. And then headlights stretched a little further down the road, and that's when we saw dozens of people. By the time we rolled closer, it became clear that there weren't 10 or 20, there were nearly 100 men lining the road. They stood on both sides, stretching far beyond what our headlights could fully illuminate, all of them dressed in dark clothing with their faces covered, wielding a long wooden stick or something similar. They weren't grouped together like a crowd, but spaced out, forming a corridor through the mountain. We were all quiet. One of the Italians asked, "What is this?" But no one answered. The convoy slowed to a stop. Up ahead, a few of the men stepped into the road, not rushing or shouting, but positioning themselves so it was clear no vehicle could get through. The first van came to a halt, and then all of us did. And suddenly it hit me how deep we were with no signal, surrounded on both sides by rows of silent figures that didn't move. One of the men approached the first van. You could tell from a distance how chill he was. No aggression. He went from van to van, and when he reached ours, he tapped lightly on the driver's window. The driver lowered the window, and the man spoke in a casual tone that this was their territory. He explained there was a fee for passing through. Behind him, the line of men seemed endless in the dark. Inside, the Italian couple had completely frozen, and one of them kept whispering that this was not okay. No one argued, money was exchanged, and we left. As we passed the last of them, I looked back through the rear window. Even as the convoy moved on, they didn't disperse. They just remained, no doubt waiting for the next person to come through to ask for their fee. But all the same, meeting them in the darkness like that, lots of men who could very easily do anything they wanted to any lonely passengers in the middle of nowhere, you feel very, very small and vulnerable. Be careful when you go to Palenque. I was about halfway home, cutting through a stretch of backwoods highway I'd driven 100 times before. It was a long, dead straight 2-lane road that sliced through open farmland. There were no streetlights or houses. Picture this, fields and trees on either side, and that's it. So as you can imagine, I was quite isolated, and when I noticed a light in my rearview mirror, at first I thought it was a motorcycle, as it was just a single headlight far back, barely more than a pinprick. But even from that distance, something felt off. The road, as I said, was perfectly straight, so I could track it easily, and it was closing the gap very quickly. I checked my mirror again maybe a second later, and it had already gained an insane amount of ground. I told myself it was probably some guy on a sport bike, pushing it on an empty road, but still, I kept my speed steady, hands locked on the wheel. I thought I'd just let them pass. And as I got closer, I started to hear something I did not expect, as it was not the high-pitched whine of a motorcycle, but this deep, violent howling, like something massive being pushed past its limit. By the time it was right behind me, the noise had turned into a full-on mechanical scream, and then pulled alongside me. For a split second, it illuminated in my peripheral vision, and I saw what it was. Not a bike, not a truck. A massive old pickup that was completely wrecked and only had one working headlight, and even that was pointing off at a crooked angle, shining uselessly towards the ditch up on the trees. The entire front end was crushed inwards, metal folded and twisted like something heavy had slammed into it at full speed. The grille was bent into an unnatural shape. For a moment, I thought I saw something dark smeared across the hood. The engine sounded like it was seconds away from exploding. Smoke poured from under the hood. I couldn't see the driver's face, just the vague outline of someone hunched over the wheel. It blasted past me like I wasn't even moving. I instinctively eased off the gas, heart hammering, watching it disappear ahead of me. The crooked beam of that single headlight bounced wildly as it sped down the road. Within seconds, it was just a distant erratic glow, and then it was gone. I sat there for a moment, barely breathing, trying to process what I had just seen. The smell of burnt oil and something metallic lingered in the air after it had gone. I told myself it had just been some idiot who wrecked their truck and was trying to get away before anyone noticed. But then, there was no way a truck should have been able to move like that, let alone run. Not at those speeds, not in the condition it was in. The next morning, out of pure curiosity, I checked the local news. There had been a crash reported not far from that same stretch of road. Multiple vehicles and several people had died. Witnesses said the truck responsible fled the scene before emergency services even arrived. They described it as an older, oversized pickup truck. Guess I know who I saw that night. I'd like to start by saying that I'm a 19-year-old woman, and my fiancé, who is also 19, are genuinely terrified right now. And this situation has been building over time with multiple incidents that continue to escalate. We recently moved into my grandparents' old trailer, which is a double-wide sitting deep in the woods with only 3 other trailers scattered somewhere nearby, far enough that you do not really see or hear anyone, unless you are looking for them. And while he is completely new to the area, I have known this place since I was a kid. So at first I felt somewhat comfortable being here, despite how isolated it is, especially since the rent is cheap, and we have the entire place to ourselves without anyone bothering us. It had been about a month since he moved in when things first started happening, and I honestly thought he was just letting his imagination get the better of him when he told me he saw something run past the back window late one night, because living out in the woods means you are going to see animals from time to time, and it is easy to mistake shadows or movement in the low light for something more than it really is. However, that doubt disappeared the moment I saw it for myself, which happened while I was standing in the kitchen near the front of the trailer, right beside an entire wall of windows that were covered only by a thin, sheer curtain that you can still see through if you're paying attention. My cat, who was still just a kitten, started going crazy at the window while I was cooking. I initially ignored it, because she gets worked up over anything that moves. But then, my fiancé walked in and immediately said, "There it is. Do you see it this time?" in a tone that made my stomach drop before I even turned to look, because the second I turned my head, I froze completely. Because whatever it was moved so fast that I only caught the back half of its body as it disappeared out of sight. And even in that brief glimpse, I could tell it was not anything normal, because it was grey, with patchy-looking fur, extremely lanky with long legs, and unnaturally quick in a way that did not match any animal I have ever seen around here. I turned back towards him, completely horrified, and even though that was the last time we actually saw it clearly, we never stopped hearing it, which somehow made everything worse. It meant something was still out there, even when we could not see it. At first I tried to convince myself it might have been a coyote, but the size and speed did not make sense, and we do not have dogs around here because the landlord does not allow them, while wolves are not a possibility either, since we live in a southern state where they are not present, which left us without any real explanation that felt grounded or reassuring. Funnily enough, the next major incident happened on Halloween night, which only made the timing feel worse. When I got home late from work around 10 in the evening, we decided to try and relax, and in the spirit of the holiday, decided to watch horror movies together in the living room, trying to ignore the uneasiness that had already been building over the past few weeks. We were about halfway through the movie when he suddenly paused it without saying anything, and when I asked him why, he just told me to be quiet in a way that immediately put me on edge, because he was clearly listening out for something. After a few moments, he brushed it off and started the movie again, saying it was probably nothing, but then I heard it too, clear as day. The unmistakable sound of our back doorknob slowly twisting, as if someone was trying to get in, even though we always kept the doors locked, especially at night. We paused the movie again and sat there listening in complete silence at the sound as it came and went, repeating just enough times to make it impossible to ignore or explain away as something random. Eventually he went back to the bedroom at the back of the trailer, which is right next to the back door, and came back with his shotgun, positioning himself near the door and waiting to see if anything else would happen. But after a few minutes of silence, he lowered the gun and came back to sit with me, clearly trying not to overreact. The second he sat down, the doorknob began twisting again, louder this time, and at this point I was in tears, because the fear had fully set in and there was no way to rationalize what we were hearing. He decided he was going to go outside and check, even though I begged him not to, because the idea of whatsoever was out there being close enough to touch our door was already too much, but he refused to stay inside. So I grabbed my rifle and followed him, because I was not about to let him go out alone in the dark. We made a full lap around the trailer, checking every side carefully, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no movement or anything. After that night, things did not stop. They only became more subtle, with tapping sounds showing up on the windows and along the walls at random times, almost like something was deliberately trying to get our attention. Then last night, it escalated again, when I heard something moving on the roof. And since we have a tin roof, any movement up there is loud and impossible to miss, which meant something with enough weight to make noise was walking above us while we were trying to sleep. At this point we were barely sleeping at all, constantly on edge, especially once it gets dark, because every small noise feels like it could be the start of something happening again, and the stress was starting to wear us down. We tried to figure out if there was anything in the area that could explain it, and we ended up walking down one of those nearby trails where we found a clearing with a large mound that had a direct view of our back door, which immediately stood out, because that is where most of the activity had been happening. Later, I asked my little sister about it, and she told me the exact same spot was where she used to have a hideout when she was younger, which explained the mound itself, but did nothing to explain everything else that had been going on around the trailer. The activity has only gotten more frequent since then, especially the doorknob twisting at night, which now happens over and over without stopping for extended periods of time. While I was at work during a recent storm, my fiancé kept texting me non-stop, saying the lights were flickering and the noises were getting worse. And even after the storm passed, the doorknob continued to move, like someone was still out there trying to get in. On top of that, there have been moments inside the trailer where we cannot explain either, like when I clearly heard him call from me from another room, only to find him sitting with all his friends on a game, all of them confirming he hadn't said anything at all. He also mentioned hearing whistling that he thought was coming from me, even though I cannot whistle, which only adds to the confusion and fear, because it means whatever is happening is not just outside anymore, or at least not staying outside. We have started looking into getting cameras so we can finally see what is actually going on. This happened about 40 years ago. I was in love with motorcycles. I had always dreamed of owning one. Me and my friend decided that when we were 17, we were going to get our very own. And we both did. We worked all summer, saved up enough money, we already had some in the bank from before, and we got our very first cycles. Well, what do you know? That within 2 weeks of owning his, he has a catastrophic crash and is no longer with us. And that's how I lost my best friend from my childhood. Now, you'd think something like this happening to me would deter me from riding my bike, but you're forgetting that I was 17 and thought I was invincible, despite what happened to my friend. So anyway, I was driving late in the evening. It must have been around 7, just getting dark. That annoying time of day when the last vestiges of sunlight are partially illuminating the sky that is slowly being swallowed in darkness, and headlights at that time I find come on, but it can make it hard to see. So anyway, there was me, looking all cool in my bike, hair whipping behind my head, driving my bike. For context, I was in the absolute middle of nowhere. I was coming from a rather large town and heading to my home out in the boonies. My parents lived quite remote. This was one of the perks of having a bike. I now had the freedom and flexibility to go where I pleased, when I pleased. And bikes were cheap, at least. They were 40 years ago. So anyway, picture me on this country road. I was just turning in and started making my way forward when I must have twisted my head, looked at something that distracted me for just a split second. Well, around this country lane comes a car, and within about 1 second, I realize too late that there's going to be a collision, and a collision there is. The person either doesn't see me or didn't have enough time to react, but they slam into me and I get thrown off the bike onto the bonnet and land on the floor. My bike gets thrown to the ditch and I lay there crumpled on the grass on the side of the road for I don't know how long. The person never stuck around. They left me for dead or injured, and I don't know who they are, but I'll never forgive them for that. I woke up and it was pitch dark. Remember, this was in a time before cell phones were a thing, and so studying my surroundings with pain all over my head or body, I am a bit disoriented and do not know what to do. I look around, and there's one solitary streetlight illuminating a small patch of grass nearby in an orange haze. The light doesn't illuminate the ditch, so I can't see my bike very well. So with my hands I try and make my way down, slip, fall on my ass, and grab my bike. I try and pull it up, but immediately noticed that it was broken, with several parts now detached. I could no longer remember which specifically. Point being, the bike was now inoperable, and there's no way I was going to be getting home with it. I didn't really want to drag it all the way home. I still had a hell of a walk to go, and it was pitch black. I roughly knew my way, but I had no way of contacting my family to let them know this had happened to me, and I was quite sure I should probably go to the hospital, seeing as my head was feeling like it had been hit by a large stick repeatedly, and I had bruises and cuts all over my body. I get my bike and the adjoining pieces and hide them in a bush behind the road, hoping that by the time I can recover it, it hasn't been stolen. And then I start making my way, meandering through the wood. I go to where the streetlight is and look around. I know there aren't houses for a while, but I start making my way in the general direction of my home. As I'm walking, my head is feeling worse. I'm feeling faint, thinking I might have internal bleeding or something and starting to panic in my stupidity. How could I have been so stupid to think I wanted to use a bike after my friend literally died a month ago is beyond me. The inescapable idiocy of youth, I suppose. To cut a long story short, I walked for about an hour or more, got completely lost and had no idea where I was or how to get home. It was dark, there was barely any moonlight, and I sat down on the floor and started to weep. I had never felt so pathetic and vulnerable in my life. After a few minutes of crying, I got up, and crying still, I kept on walking. And that is when I saw a light in a window. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't care whose it was. I approached that light until I came upon a small house. I went around and found the door and knocked, and thankfully, an old woman answered the door. Now, it being the countryside, I knew most of the people who lived around, but I had never seen her. She asked what was wrong, and I told her that I had just crashed my bike and that I really needed some help, or a telephone preferably. She told me she didn't have a telephone, but she could definitely see to my head, cuts and bruises, and took me inside. She gave me soup, which I ate very happily. The house was very old on the inside and looked like it hadn't been updated in years, and it was still quite dark. She told me to sit on the sofa, and it was there that I passed out. When I woke up, it was morning, and I felt slightly awkward being in a stranger's home that I didn't know. But something about it now seemed different. As I said, the house definitely had that old feel to it, but now it looked abandoned. I looked towards the table where I had had my soup and the bowl was gone. The place looked kind of creepy, like it hadn't been lived in or used in a long time. I got up off the sofa, which looked like it had been covered in dust and dirt, and feeling slightly creeped out, started to look around the place. It was a 2-bedroom shack, is the best way to describe it, or modest home, I could say. I looked around. The old lady wasn't here. There was one door, which I knew was the door to what must have been the bedroom, and knocked gently on the door. The taps echoed in the room. I waited and heard nothing, and then I said, "Excuse me," and knocked again, and was met with no reply. So, I twisted the handle and pushed the door open gingerly and looked inside. There was a bed in there, old, with faded blankets, but no one else was in there. I assumed the lady had left. I had told myself I'd leave her a note, but I looked around for pen and paper, but couldn't find any of it, and only just realized just how derelict and empty this place felt. I looked around one more time and told myself I'd try the light switch. There was definitely illumination last night, but now it was unresponsive, like there had been a power cut or the electricity had been cut off. I didn't really have an explanation for that. So, after finding no way to leave my message, I decided to just leave it be, and walked out the front door. I still wasn't exactly sure where I was, but after walking for a little while, I rediscovered the main road and quickly made my way back, after only an extra half an hour walk. By the time I made it home, my parents were in an absolute tizzy. They had found my abandoned bike. Turns out my dad had worried about me not coming home after hours and saw the reflection of my mirror in a bush. When he saw my bike and that I wasn't there, he assumed the worst. He had gone to visit hospitals, called the police. No one had seen me. They were just so relieved that I had come home, especially after my friend died, you know. My dad begged me and my mum to never go on the motorcycle again, and I told them it was fine. My dad had already brought it back in his trailer and agreed that they'd fix it up and we'd sell it, and I could get a car instead. When they asked where I'd been, I told them how I'd meandered through the woods until I finally stumbled upon this old house. Told him that an old woman had helped me in the night and then I'd passed out on her sofa, only to wake up, the place look sort of abandoned. and there'd be no one there. A few days passed and my parents inquired again about where I'd been, because they wanted to thank the old lady who had helped me. My mum had brought her some flowers and some chocolate, and we wanted to go thank her together. So, me and her went in the general direction of where she lived during the day, and when I finally found the shack and knocked on the door, there was no answer. I walked in, the door wasn't locked, knocked on the door of the room, and there was still no reply. My mum found it really odd. When she reported this to my dad, and he had a better idea of where it was, his face went white. He got out one of his old maps and pointed to where the old shack was, even though he didn't know where it should be, and we confirmed that was probably where it was on the map. He went whiter still. My dad had known someone who lived there when he was younger. She was out in the village and had fallen down suddenly. My dad, seeing this, went to help her immediately. She had a serious problem and knew she'd broken something, so my dad took her to the hospital. Turns out she had broken her hip. When my dad asked who he could call for her, she said she had no living family because she had no children, and asked him to stay with her while the doctors attended her. He agreed. Once she was on the mend, he checked in on her every once in a while in that same shack, would occasionally bring her little cakes and stuff just to see if she was okay. She died shortly after, and the shack had just been left in disrepair. That's the thing that my dad found most curious. She was long dead. He knew that. And when he asked about the woman, I told him what she looked like, but said that my head was thrumming in pain, and the details could be all skewed up because I was exhausted and unwell. But our descriptions matched up. My dad likes to think that his kindness in helping her in her time of need perhaps brought her back from whatever realm the spirits live in, for her to do one favor for his son. I don't know what the truth is, but I'm just grateful that I got the help I needed, and I never rode a bike again. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. I hope you have enjoyed our collection of middle of nowhere scary stories. I will be back on Thursday with some Glitch in the Matrix stories, which I really hope you enjoy. And I would like to give one extra special thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for their continued support of the channel. And if you would like your name in the end credits, a shout out on your birthday, and many other perks, feel free to find the link to Patreon down below for more info. But that's it from me, guys. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night. Before the video begins, I would like to wish a very happy birthday to Miss Liberty 1776. I hope you've had a wonderful day. And if you'd like your birthday shout out, check out Patreon. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened when I was 11. That was at this point well in excess of 40 years ago, so the fact that I remember it so clearly should tell you just how deeply it affected me. My family has a lot of mildly sensitive people in it. For most of us, it's just when we're kids, and by the time we hit double digits, it's long since gone. But that was not the case for me. I was definitely much more sensitive as a child than I am now, but I still seem to be able to pick up on a lot of things that other people don't. Anyway, back then I was still fairly sensitive, and that does have reference to this story. What happened was that my mother had played musical chairs, the religious version, my entire childhood, and when I turned 10, she landed on the chair for the Mormon religion. Nice people for the most part, but I am not an at all religious person and never have been. But my mother decided to sign me up for the church summer camp. She was going as a counselor, so she was there as well. Well, in the classic vein of every summer camp ever, there was a story that was told about a ghost in the woods. The story basically said that the woods were haunted by the ghost of a young man who had drowned after falling off a dock out on the river just a little ways into the woods. In a fit of the usual preteen idiocy, my cabin mates and I decided that we were going to sneak out on the last night to look for the ghost in the woods. Of course, none of us expected to find anything, but it was something creepy and fun to do. So at about 10:30 that night, lights out was at 9, the 10 of us slipped out the back window of the cabin with one flashlight, and absolutely no idea which way we were heading or anything. Needless to say, we got hopelessly lost. Tell them it was just a bunch of 11 to 12-year-old girls fumbling around in the woods at night trying to scare each other. It had been a near full moon when we left the cabin, but not too long after we got into the woods, the moon disappeared, and suddenly it was very, very dark, and we didn't have enough flashlights. As we all started to kind of realize just how screwed we were, and that this very fun idea had not actually been very smart, things started to get creepy. With the lack of light, we decided to walk in a single line so that no one could get lost. Each of us put our hands on the shoulders of the girl in front of us. I was actually the first one in line because I was the one who actually remembered to bring a flashlight. Anyway, we start walking around in a straight line in what we think is the direction we came from, trying to get back to the camp, when I started to get a really strong feeling that we were going the wrong way. I literally heard someone say, as if they were right next to me, "That way isn't safe, go right." It was a male voice, and as I have mentioned, there's 10 of us out there and we're all young girls. This was not the voice of anyone in our group. Anyway, following my sensitive gut feeling, I listened to the voice. I just had this feeling that it could be trusted. Anyway, at first I didn't say anything to the rest of the group about hearing the voice. I certainly didn't tell them that I was following its directions until the third time I heard it. Of course, we all evolved into a group of terrified screaming children for about 20 minutes or so, but then we realized that no matter what else was going on, we really needed to get back to camp. So we lined back up with our hands on each other's shoulders and proceeded to walk again. I continued to get the feeling and whispered directions, but the other girls started experiencing things as well. None of them heard a voice, but what they did experience was the sensation of a hand on one shoulder or the other, gently pulling them left to right. And it was never just one of them, it would literally be the entire line of us that would gently be pushed one after the other. As I said, it was not a shove, it was a gentle push to make us move off the side. This happened to all of us at least 24 times over the course of the next several hours as we walked through the woods trying to find our way back to camp. We were located somewhere around 4 a.m. and escorted back to camp, at which point we are all babbling hysterically, and one of the counselors had to sit us all down and get us all to calm down before they could even get the story straight out of us. Now that alone is a pretty creepy story, but it's something that seems fairly subjective and would easily be dismissed and forgotten about, right? What really brought it all home was what happened the next day. We were not slated to depart until 4 p.m. the following day, so we basically had the whole day at camp before we would be going home. All of us girls had been sent to sleep and were not woken up until lunchtime because we had not slept the night and were all physically and mentally exhausted. But we were all very surprised to be rounded up and told that we would be going on a walk in the woods because the camp counselors and whatnot had some serious questions for us about the previous night. So basically, we were let out into the woods and we basically walked the exact same path we had taken the night before. At first our path was very random, as we had literally just tried to find our way through the woods, but it turned out that we had been heading towards a cliff that overlooked the river. There was about a 40-foot drop that we were heading straight for, and you could tell that we had stopped and taken a sharp turn to the right about 10 feet before we would have hit that cliff. When we walked parallel to the cliff for almost half a mile on a downward slope until we docked close to the river. We could hear the river, so we had realized we were close to it, but we never saw it. What really had everyone scratching their heads was the fact we came down the hill along the edge of the cliff, and then we had walked out onto an old, rotting loading wharf. It wasn't a small dock like we had pictured in our minds hearing the ghost story. This thing was massive, like the size of a football field cut in half lengthwise, and it was full of rotted spots. We had walked across it in a weaving pattern that literally traced the only safe path across the dock, and we never even knew we were on it. But that is when we had felt the hands, because we have been walking fairly level, and then when we turned to the right after I heard the voice tell me that way isn't safe to go, we had all started going downhill very noticeably, and it was when it leveled out again that we felt the hands. That would have been when we were on the dock. Those hands kept us alive and got us across the dock safely. We walked close to 150 feet of rotting wood, and not a single one of us so much as stumbled. But in the daylight you can clearly see the scuffed path along the dock that we had walked, and it was nothing like a straight line. Most of the counselors did not believe that we had encountered a ghost, much less that he had guided us and saved our lives. I think my mum was the only one who kind of believed us. They all just said that we were incredibly lucky, and they were going to let our parents decide what our punishment should be, as they would be informing all of them about our little midnight escapade. That's pretty much it. I never went back and never heard from any of the other girls again, since none of them went to the same church that I did. That's not my only ghost story, of course, but it's definitely one of the strangest things to ever happen to me. This happened years ago when I was a teenager, during a long drive through a remote stretch of the northern Maine woods. My mother and I had taken a back highway that cut through miles of timberland. It wasn't the kind of road people used unless they really had to. Small logging towns sat hours apart, and for long stretches there was absolutely nothing but forest pressing in on both sides. That night, the weather turned bad. Rain was coming down in heavy sheets. The temperature had dropped too, cold enough that mist had hung low over the ground. The trees along the highway were tall spruce and pine, packed so tightly together that our headlights barely reached past the first line of trunks. For almost 40 miles we hadn't passed another car. About halfway between two tiny towns, the road curved slightly and ran alongside an old, overgrown logging trail that disappeared into the woods. A narrow creek ran somewhere out there too. I remember hearing it later when we rolled the window down, but at the time all I could see was the forest and rain. Then I saw someone standing at the edge of the road. At first I thought it was just a trick of the rain or a road sign, but as we got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a man standing on the shoulder, maybe a foot from the asphalt, angled towards the road like he was about to step out in front of us, and my stomach dropped instantly. He was wearing a dark green canvas jacket that looked soaked through, and a pair of muddy jeans tucked into heavy work boots. The clothes looked old, like something a logger might wear, and they hung stiffly on him as the rain poured down. He wasn't moving. As we got closer, the headlights lit up his face, and that's when I realized something was horribly wrong. The entire left side of his face looked destroyed. Not just bruised or cut, but destroyed. The skin looked torn open and crushed like it had been dragged across pavement. One side of his jaw hung wrong, and there was dark blood soaking through the collar of his jacket. Even the left side of his chest looked flattened and mangled under the fabric. The closest thing I could compare it to is roadkill. But the strangest part wasn't just the injuries. It was his expression. He wasn't panicking or waving for help. He wasn't even reacting to the truck barreling towards him through the rain. He was just staring at us completely blank. His eyes followed the truck as we passed, like he was watching us from very far away. For a split second our headlights lit him up fully, and I remember seeing the rain hit his face and run through the blood on that ruined side of his head, and we drove past him. I twisted around in my seat to keep looking through the back window, and the shoulder on the road behind us was now empty. I felt a cold wave of panic crawl up my spine. "Did you see that guy?" I asked my mum immediately. She took a moment to answer and then said, "Yeah." We slowed down for a little, both of us looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone stumble onto the road behind us, but there was no one there. My mum has ridden motorcycles most of her life, and after a few minutes she said something that made the whole thing worse. She said the injuries looked like exactly what happened in a high-speed motorcycle crash, like when someone had been thrown across the pavement. We tried for years to search for fatal reports that happened on that stretch of road, but nothing ever came up. I live in central Ontario, Canada, and one summer, about 3 years ago, I had taken a job opportunity in a small town up north in Muskoka. The town itself was quaint and surrounded by woods. I worked in town during the day, and by night I would leave work to stay at one of the cottages owned by my boss and the business owner I worked for. The cottage I stayed in was shared by the owner and 3 other employees, surrounded by trees and forests with other cottages spread sporadically around the area. The property had the cottage on one side perched up on a rock face, with a large set of stairs leading down to the lower section of the property that sat right along the local lake. On the lower section of the property, there was a boathouse followed by a sauna and a small separate building nearby. We worked long days, from morning till dusk, and would often use the sauna as a place to unwind and relax together. The sauna sat right in front of the lake, so it was great to get real warm and toasty in the sauna and then walk into the lake to cool off before jumping back into the heat. One night, after a long day of work, I had arrived back at the cottage at around 11 p.m, feeling more stiff and achy than usual. It was that night that I decided it would be a good night for some time in the sauna. I asked the others that I stayed with if they wanted to join me, but there were no takers, as they decided to have a few drinks that night instead. That was no problem for me. I still wanted to go and take a solo trip down there instead, and after grabbing my swimming trunks and towel, I headed out and walked down the large flight of stairs past the boathouse and arrived at the sauna. I turned the sauna on and took a seat to unwind in the heat. After about 10 minutes of heat and steam from stoking the rocks with water, I had felt it was time to cool off and reset myself. I opened the door to the sauna, and the warm light from the lamp was illuminating my way. I walked down towards the dark lake, and as I approached the lake, I slowly walked into the water as it was a bit cool that night. When I reached about knee level in the water, I was abruptly alerted by a loud and drawn-out whistling sound. I stopped dead in my tracks, full body tingling with goosebumps, and scanned the area for what that possibly could have been. But there was nothing but trees, darkness, and the small amount of light illuminating from the sauna. In my mind, I was searching for logical answers, and assumed it was a local animal, or perhaps one of my roommates trying to play a prank on me and scare me as a joke. I brushed it off, and whistled back a tone of my own. Almost immediately after I stopped whistling, I heard the exact same tone whistling back to me from the tree line. It came right back in my direction, and I thought to myself, now that couldn't possibly have been an animal. It perfectly copied my tone and cadence, so I chalked it up to it being one of my roommates. I whistled in a more sporadic and bizarre way this time to see if it would copy me once again, and I whistled into the darkness. Instantly, I received the exact same tone as it whistled it back. Not a single beat missed, but this time closer than before. A spine-chilling cold drew over my body. It felt like every hair on my body was standing straight up, and every drop of blood from my limbs escaped me. I was paralyzed in fear and had no explanation for that sound, and my only reaction was to leave everything behind and make it back to the cottage as fast as possible. So I booked it back up the stairs and into the cottage, only to see every one of my roommates sitting around the table, with no sign of them having been outside. I tried to calm myself and asked them if anyone had been out there and heard the whistling. Everyone said no, that they'd been sitting there the whole time. And that was when silence fell over the room. To this day, the most bone-chilling and unexplainable experience I've ever had was that. I didn't know not to whistle outside before this occurred, but after doing research and looking for answers, I now know not to do so, and also understand why. This story connects to a creepy experience and the dread of war from my country in the Western Balkans. I heard it from my old relative, whose cousin was one of the soldiers who encountered the Austro-Hungarian soldat Johann. The story dates from World War I and can also be found in the journal of a Serbian officer who was part of the group. The journal is preserved somewhere in a museum in Western Serbia. Note, this story happened during the battle on Mount Ser, and Johann's story goes as follows. We were advancing from the Drina, hauling our howitzers up a hill that you Serbs call the Eagle's Nest. Once we reached the summit, we could clearly see open meadows below, a sure sign that villagers were nearby. Our command post was set up along the edge of one such clearing, where tall turkey oaks cast shade from the August sun. I was looking for my comrade Franz, who was carrying a stack of potatoes to the field kitchen, when I heard a faint whomp in the distance. At that moment, the first shell landed among our positions, right beside where the horses and draft oxen were tethered. The Serbian scouts and artillery had found us. The next whomp struck near the command tent. The third I don't remember. I believe it landed close to me, and I was thrown into a nearby creek. When I came to, it was already dark. I was badly concussed and had no sense of direction and no way to find my unit. All I could hear was the call of the night owl and the breeze moving through the treetops. I don't know how long I wandered along the creek downstream when I saw the dark outline of a watermill beside a large pale stone. It was one of your Serbian watermills with a moss-covered hip roof. I didn't hear the millstone turning. It looked abandoned since Ottoman times. Inside there was a stone sleeping platform positioned directly opposite the entrance, with the millstone resting beside it. Nearby stood a small wooden three-legged stool next to what must have once been a campsite. The wooden ceiling was low, and I cursed myself for not climbing onto it to sleep instead. And I lit a flyer on the floor that evening. I must have fallen asleep partially from the pain and partially from listening to the fire crackle. It was past midnight when I awoke and opened my right eye. I thought I saw something dark poking at the flames, and I assumed it was from shelling. Then I opened both eyes and saw the face of a young woman with black hair, wearing a black military coat that I had never seen before, staring into the fire. I couldn't see her legs because she was crouched low. I sat up, but she paid no attention to me and only stared into the flames. My gut told me something was wrong. I took one of the broken chair legs and pretended to tend the fire, waiting until the wood glowed red. Then, without warning, I thrust it beneath her coat. She leapt back, revealing goat legs with black hooves. She let out a sound somewhere between a baby's cry and laughter and ran out the mill, cursing me in my own language. When I finally came to my senses, I ran outside as well, scrambling uphill away from the mill and the stream. I don't know how long I ran, but I stumbled straight into your ambush, and after that I remember nothing. Johann was shot in the belly and collapsed. Later, he was transported to the field hospital of the Serbian army, where he was recovered and exchanged as a prisoner. There is where he shared this story. This happened this week. I took my son and his friend for a planned 3-day hike along Laurel Highlands hiking trail in Pennsylvania. This was their first overnight hike, so we were all excited. We made it to our first night shelter just before dark. We got a fire going in front of the shelter, which had a fireplace and chimney in front of 3 walled shelters. There were no other hikers on the trail, and no one else had reserved a spot at the campsite. So we got camp settled, ate dinner, and the guys put on some music while we were just turning in for the night. That was when I first heard it, from at least a few hundred yards away. There was a loud knocking noise like someone hit a heavy branch against the tree. The second time was closer, and my son heard that one. The hair on my neck stood up, and I continued to listen. The boys eventually dozed off, and I could hear their light snoring as they slept. But the knocking continued, be it a few minutes or 10 between each knock. Eventually I would hear what sounded like a small sapling being jolted near the boundary of our camp. It was at that point I used my bright flashlight to spot the woods in all directions, but didn't catch anything. Just as I began to relax and fall asleep, it began again. It was the same pattern, but now, below us on the ridge, I positioned my body so I could see both sides of the chimney. One of the boys moved in their sleep, making a noise in their sleeping pad. This alerted something behind our shelter as I heard it take off again. Again, I didn't catch it with my light. This continued twice more through the night, and I didn't sleep until the sky began to get light. When my son's friend's alarm went off, he claimed in his stupor that he saw the shape of someone standing next to our fireplace. But when he went for his light, it was gone. He fell asleep before the first knock and had no idea what happened all night. I've heard raccoons smashing fresh water clams off rocks before, but for the life of me, I don't know what it was. I know my first thought was Bigfoot, as there are stories in this parts of Pennsylvania going back centuries, but I am trying to be rational. I just know something primal deep within me was triggered when that first knock sounded. I put my headlamp and glasses on and got positioned to act, and had my pistol out and ready if needed. But I never forget the way the hair on the back of my neck felt at that moment. This encounter took place when I was around 10, on a trip to India that my family and I embarked on, and we went up north to Kashmir in Ladakh to visit family. Now, if you don't know Ladakh, it's a region of India way up in the north and has disputed borders with China and Tibet. All in all, it's a pretty remote and isolated area. We were staying in a rather rural area on the top of this mountain, looking out into forested mountainsides in most directions. It was gorgeous. There was no light pollution or traffic, just us and nature. The first couple of nights I slept amazingly, probably the best sleep I've ever had and ever will. The day before I saw this creature, we decided to go on a hike in the Himalayan mountain range. The sky was clear, our visibility was great, and it wasn't deathly cold outside as it was during summer. The first part of the hike was great, beautiful views and breathtaking nature, and I remember we got to the flat area of the trail and it started to get cloudy outside. Some of us wanted to head back, but we decided to push on. Only a couple of minutes later it started raining, cold, icy, hard bits of rain. When we realized it turned into hail, we all ran for cover as the size of the hail grew. I was always the runt of the group, small and scrawny, so I wedged myself under this massive rock. It was almost like a shallow cave. I could see everyone running for cover, but the mouth of the opening was shaped so that it had this overhang where no one could really see me. It felt like we waited there forever, when in reality it was probably only a few minutes. But while I was wedged into that crack, I realized that it was completely dry, which was strange because the wind was strong and definitely would have blown the rain and hail into the opening. I had this weird sinking gut feeling, like when you know you messed up and all the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I was frozen in fear. I originally thought because the crack was so low that nothing could fit in here, and I didn't realize that the hole I was in went a lot further back into the rock than I had realized. Something else was sitting here moments before I crammed my way in. I didn't care, it was still hailing, and I scrambled my way out, not looking back. Everyone was surprised to see me come out. They all had lost sight of me and didn't know where I had gone. But I wanted to get the hell out of there, and I rounded everyone up as the stubborn 11-year-old I was and forced us to run back down the trail. Luckily at that time, the hail became less severe and just felt like heavy raindrops. Though normally couldn't keep my mouth shut, I decided not to tell anyone about my experience in that hole, because I knew I was just going to get scolded. I felt off for the rest of the day and tried to enjoy the rest of nature with my family, but I felt weirdly sick. I just chalked it up to the lack of oxygen at that height and went on with the trip. The day goes on, and that night was when the encounter happened. Related? I'm not sure, but I think I disturbed something when I hid under that rock. So we're half a week into the trip. It was night time, maybe 1 a.m. My sister and I had stayed up exploring with my dad. By the time my sister had settled down, it was me and my dad. Neither of us were tired yet, so he asked if I wanted to go stargaze. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with space, constellations, black holes, dark matter. I loved it all. And as a kid, I grew up in this city with light pollution everywhere, so the chances to stargaze were slim to none. I jumped at this chance. I didn't really want to go anywhere outside our safe lit area, but nothing was going to stop me from seeing these stars, even if I felt a little off about it. We had to walk a few yards away from our house because even the light there could hinder us from seeing the full extent of the night sky. A little to the left of the house there was this opening. Remember, I'm on the top of a low mountain, so the opening was literally a path that led off this cliff with shrubs on either side. This was the perfect area to stargaze, because as you reach the end of the path, there are no trees to obstruct your view, and the plants on either side nicely block out any light from behind you, so of course that's where we went. It was dead silent. No wind, no crickets, which was very weird, just the gravel crunching under me and my dad's feet. I was too engrossed with counting all the constellations I could recognize to realize the silence that had fallen over us. At this point, we're about 1.5 yards away from the actual drop-off, and we don't go any closer for safety reasons. The next part I remember so vividly without a doubt. My dad had his flashlight on so we could watch our step as we got closer to the edge, and out of the dread, quiet silence there was this rustling noise in the bush off to our right. We both stopped, and my dad turned his flashlight to the bush, and this dog thing peeked its head through. I say dog thing because that's what my child brain immediately reverted to when I saw this creature. But it looked off. Its face was so insanely human that I felt like the eyes were boring into my soul. You know that reflection that animals get in their eyes when the light hits it in a certain way? This creature didn't have that. Just two pits of matte darkness. I got this weird chill up my spine, like one of us wasn't supposed to be there. Whether it was my dad, I, or this creature, I couldn't tell. Now, I've been to India a lot, and the cities have stray dogs everywhere, and I love animals probably about as much as I love space, so I would pet, feed everyone I could. In my 11-year-old animal-loving mind, this creature was a dog that could be my pet like every other, and I ignored that gut feeling that I had assumed I was feeling because of the lack of oxygen at the height we were at. So I reached out my hand as if to pet it, and it moved a little more forwards. And that's when I could tell that this dog was a really weird dog, if it even was one. Its proportions were off, like the joints in its legs were higher than they should have been. Its neck was way too long, and its fur was slick. So slick it could have been fuzzy skin. I remember my dad grasped my shoulder firmly, an obvious command to not move, and whispered, "Stop." I thought it was him being overly protective and not letting me pet a dog because it was wild and could have rabies. So I turned around to look at him and say something, but stopped, because I saw the look he was wearing on his face. It was pale and ashen. He was uneasy, scared almost. I'd never seen him look like that. So that's when I got a little freaked too. He simply said, "Don't pet that thing." I slowly turned back to it, every hair on my body standing on end, as I watched it retreat a little further, back into the bushes. Its eyes never left mine. That's the part I remember so vividly. It never broke eye contact with me. Its eyes didn't flit around like a cornered or aggressive animal. Even humans don't hold eye contact the way that thing stared at me. My dad turned off the flashlight, maybe to use it as a weapon or something, but just as the light left, the thing vanished into the darkness. I don't know how long we stood there. Part of us expected it to come lunging back, but it never did. And here's the other thing. There was nowhere for it to go. As I mentioned earlier, we were staying on the top of a mountain, a low one but still a fairly steep one. My dad and I were at the edge of a drop-off with no way up or down into the area. On either side of that path to the drop-off were low bushes, and on either side of those bushes were more houses. Unless that thing buried a hole under the bushes or somehow made its way down that steep mountain drop with no noise, then I have no idea where it could have gone. If anyone has any idea on what this might have been, or had a similar encounter in India, then I'd love to hear it. I'm looking for any campers, hikers, or Native American experts who have experienced high strangeness at the Ghana State Park or the Frio River. I'm finally telling the exact story of what happened to my friend and me years ago, because it still haunts me. We were young, drinking, and being complete idiots, and camped near the river opposite the soccer pitch, right under the shadow of the old, baldy cliffs. Despite warnings from other campers that the spirits there are protective, I started aimlessly chopping at a tree with a hatchet, taking a huge chunk out of it for no reason. We threw trash around and basically treated the place like a dumpster. And that night, the retribution began. It started with shadows against the tent wall. There wasn't enough light to cast a shadow, but the air outside seemed to intensify in a weird cold glow that shouldn't have been there. Through the nylon, I saw what I can only describe as the little people. They were about 3 feet tall, incredibly stocky, and had a dramatic hunched-over posture. They were completely covered in thick, matted, ancient-looking hair, and began ritualistically marching in a tight circle around the tent. The chilling part? As they circled us, they didn't walk. They were rhythmically rising up and down, almost like a predatory bobbing motion, while whispering in a low, guttural chant that we couldn't understand. Then, they started poking the tent. They pushed into the fabric so hard it was actually hitting my friend's head. We were terrified. Every time we unzipped the tent to scream at them, the campsite was empty. The second we unzipped, the rising and falling shadows and chanting would disappear, and re-zipped, they'd return. One of them was holding a stick, and I swear I saw the silhouette of a necklace made of bone around its thick neck. Could it have been the Nonipi? Maybe Pakwaji? I've heard Comanche legends describing rock people who guard the limestone canyons of the hill country. Has anyone else experienced this rising, falling, circling behavior, or the physical poking? We didn't believe the warnings until the forest literally surrounded us. I was very skeptical of the paranormal until this happened to me. I don't understand how me and my buddy could see the same thing, and how every time we unzipped, there was basically nothing there. On a road trip, a friend and I decided to stop at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary and camp nearby. We knew the history of the place and had read up on it on the way there. A friend of mine came along. She was very into the spiritual side of things and wanted to look for ghosts. That was mostly her interest, though we were all curious about the prison itself. In person, the place is imposing. It's a huge grey prison set hard against the mountain wall and surrounded by thick Tennessee woods. The trees and hills feel alive, and then there is this massive block of concrete sitting among them, unnatural in its shape and weight. There were no tours or concerts that day, and the place felt quiet. We parked in a clear lot and walked up towards the building. When we reached the courtyard, we were surprised to find the gate open. There were no signs stopping us, so we went in and began looking around. There were two men in the courtyard throwing a ball for a large dog. We noticed them but didn't think much of it until the dog wandered over to us. When that happened, one of the men came over and began chatting. Instead of asking where we were from, he asked why we were there. He pressed to know if we were part of a tour. Once he knew we weren't, he said he was contracted by the owner to do some work there and that we were not supposed to be there. He did not explain what he was doing or why the gate was open. Once he knew we were just visitors, he became short and insistent. We left the building respectfully without making a scene. We stayed at the prison and continued walking around, and my friend pointed out how odd it was that someone on official business would be working with a dog loose in the courtyard, but we tried not to dwell on it. We were still more interested in the building. Not long after, a white crossover pulled into the lot and came right up onto us. There was a woman and kid inside. She got out and immediately pushed us towards the exit. She said her man had just spoken to us and that we were not allowed there. My friend pushed back, but we still left. As we did, the woman followed us and shut the parking lot gate behind us. Once outside the site, we checked the rules and knew we could be there and that it was a common thing to do. That night we came back. We parked in the outer lot and waited, and while standing by the car, we saw a truck drive slowly the length of the road leading up to the prison. We were in the dark, and it did not see us, and continued slowly back. We talked it over. We could drive in, but if we went straight in and got run off, that was it. But if we went on foot around the drive and up the hill first, we could look around and still come back the right way. So we climbed the grassy hill beside the road, staying out of the parking lot lights. At intervals, a bright light swept up into the sky from the prison. We figured it was part of the place, a spotlight may be left for running effect. As we moved along the hill, we heard what sounded like a dirt bike somewhere beyond the lot. The noise bounced off the hills and then cut out. Not long after that, we heard screaming. It was distant and fearful, and we stopped and listened. It happened again. We whispered among ourselves, trying to decide if someone else was there, maybe someone on a tour. As we stood there, we all noticed something in the dark near us, a wild pig. We hadn't seen it at first. It shifted and started towards us. My friend grabbed both of us without hesitation and pulled us back. He had seen wild pigs before, and we backed away and ran for the car. At this point, we assumed there had to be other people at the prison. The light sweeping the sky and the sound of the dirt bike made it seem active, like there was something going on. So we drove back in openly, like we were supposed to be there. As we passed by the road, we saw the same truck parked off to the side. The kid in the back was screwing with a flashlight, pointing it up into the sky. The man was behind the truck running a chainsaw, and the woman was nearby in her white crossover watching the road. She pulled out quickly and blocked us, rolled down her window, and immediately threatened the police. My friend told her we had checked the hours. She said she knew the owner, but would not give a name or phone number, and we left again. Once we were back on the road, we called the police. They said that we were allowed to be there, but advised not to return that night and said it might not be safe. We never found out what those people were doing. Nothing that happened on its own could have meant much. Any one part of the night could have been explained away, but taken all together, it added up to something strange. And that is what stayed with us. Me and my boyfriend went on a walk at about 2 a.m. under the full moon to smoke a joint along this old railroad trail that had a giant collision back in the 1800s, and tons of people tragically died. We were walking for probably about 30 minutes at this point, and we came up on a house, which was weird as we were in the middle of the woods. It was a very old house, completely made of wood inside and out, and there was nothing inside it really, no furniture, TV or bookcases or anything. I said it was weird and looked staged, and my boyfriend said it reminded him of old mountaineering cabins. However, next to the little house was a giant metal garage. We didn't see any cars or anything, and as we were looking, I suddenly got the feeling that we shouldn't be here and that we were intruding. As we were standing there, suddenly the smell of alcohol became so strong around us, and this was after a few minutes we had already been there. It kind of smelled like an old drunk man yelling at our face. The hair was literally standing on the back of my neck and I got chills. It smelled so strong, we both were suddenly feeling dizzy, and he took my hand and we ran off. 20 feet down the path, it sounded like someone racked a gun, and even my boyfriend said it sounded like someone kicked open a wooden door by force. Every time we stopped, the smell would slowly start to come back. I almost wonder if it was a spirit protecting his privacy out there, as there was no reason for a house to be out that far. We might go back in the daytime, but we went down some twists and turns, and up some private property trails, so I think we may never find it again, even if it is there to begin with and wasn't some kind of weird rift in time to an old-fashioned railroad tender or someone who was just an alcoholic, so he didn't want to leave this plane. A few months ago, my partner and I went out to Joshua Tree for about a week after we drove down to LA for a concert. We've been to JT 4 or 5 times, so we aren't strangers to desert life. So the house we were staying in was south, bordering the park at the base of a massive rock piling/mountain. It was about half a mile from the main highway, and the closest house that I saw people in was about 1,000 feet away, and I only saw people on the final day we were staying there. We got into the Airbnb just as the sun was setting, and immediately the house felt kind of off. We unpacked, and neither of us said anything at this point, but as the clock hit about 10 p.m, the vibe in the house completely changed from weird to bad, like scary bad. We both felt like we were being watched, and the air just felt heavy. We went to bed, and when we woke up, things felt pretty much fine again. Cool. So we go about our day and end up at the house just as the sun is starting to set. I make dinner, 10 p.m. hits, and the vibes shift. I can't sleep this time, so my partner goes to bed, and I stay up in the living room writing and scrolling on my phone. Then at about 3 a.m., I heard whistling. Not just a few little wind whistles. I'm talking at least 6 seconds worth of a song whistled by lips. It was coming from outside, and after testing it the next morning, it must have been right outside the living room, because you couldn't hear whistling beyond 15 feet away from the window. Anyway, I immediately go into fight or flight mode and sit up, awake until the sun comes up with my pistol at my side. Next morning I'm freaked out. I go look outside in the sand, and there are no footprints. I test for the whistle volume and realized it must have been close. We do, however, find on the opposite side of the house some rather large paw prints. The only thing is, they don't look like back legs. Maybe it was walking so synced up that it was stepping in its own paw tracks? I don't know. There were also clearly coyote tracks up the driveway that were older, and you could see 4 clear prints. So these large prints came down out of the rock hills behind the house and went right up to the Airbnb side door into the bedroom and then vanished. It still freaked the hell out of me. As we were leaving for the day trying to figure out what the hell I heard and what the actual hell is up with the tracks, my partner calls me from the other side of the house. A roadrunner showed up out of nowhere. Like, my partner looked down and it was just there, standing right next to them. It looked and went off again. It had a crossed beak and was mangy looking, and had these huge eyes that were just constantly scanning everything. It's like when you look at an animal and can see what they're thinking. This bird was sentient. It was the strangest feeling. We thought it was sick or injured because of the beak, and called a wildlife rehab place who told us to catch it if we could and bring it to them. So we tried for a while, but it was just a little too fast. We left it uncaptured and spent the day doing other things. We decided to spend most of the night out to avoid the house, but finally ended up back well after 10 p.m, and the vibe again was heavy. I had found some spare sheets and had covered all the windows that didn't have blinds, which helped a little bit, but the feeling of being watched just wouldn't go away. That night again, I was restless and in the living room and heard a whistle. This time only 2 short little burst whistles, but they had the same human-like tone to them than the first night. I also heard this strange rustling outside, so I again stayed up until the sun came up, went outside, and couldn't find signs of anyone being there, nor any animal tracks. We spent that day at the house just trying to relax, and just as late afternoon turned into evening, the same roadrunner showed up again. I take the chance to try and catch it, but it's too fast. But this time it's doing its thing. It would run maybe 10 feet, stop, turn around, and look at me with its huge eyes and just wait. Just wait for me to get close enough to grab it and do the same thing, over and over. Before I knew it, I looked up, and the sun was starting to set, and I was almost standing in the foothills of this rock mountain. The bird led me into the foothills away from the house, and I was too focused on catching it to notice. I realized where I was, and was like, nope, this is weird, and turned around. And the bird followed me, and tried to get my attention like it wanted me to follow it. I have never had a wild animal do this to me. I got back to the house and the roadrunner was just sitting at the top of the driveway towards the hills watching us. I felt unnerved, and this was when it really hit me how sentient that thing felt. I know that it knew what it was doing. I can't explain beyond that. We had slept that night, and things were mostly quiet. We left the next morning, and as we took the trash out to the dumpster, we noticed a single human footprint in the sand at the dumpster. No boot or shoe or prints leading to it. Just one single human footprint in the sand. And if you know the area, you know that no one walks barefoot out there. It's spider hole, scorpion den, snake country. Not to mention the rocks and cactus quills that would not be pleasant to walk on. Anyway, that was when we left. We looked into it later and read something about the area being notorious for skinwalker encounters and folklore. I really knew nothing about them before, and still know very little, so take this for what it's worth. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's scary stories from the deep woods. If you did, you can let me know down below, and you can let me think of the changes I'm trying to make if you heard them from last video. I should be joining you again tomorrow, and if you would like some cool basement stories, you can find those on Patreon tomorrow as well. But that's it from me. One final thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. I'm wishing you all a great night.